The events of today are both historic and certainly controversial, with legal and political ramifications that will reverberate throughout the 2024 election and beyond. Just a few moments ago, we saw former President Trump leaving his home in Trump Tower, where he's been since his arrival in New York yesterday. And at any moment, we'll see the motorcade making its way through the heart of New York City to a courthouse in Lower Manhattan. It's a trip of about 4 miles. There will be multiple vehicles led by his Secret Service detail. By any measure, this is also something of a spectacle. Onlookers will be watching, supporters will be watching, protesters, even press from across the globe lining the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Trump before he surrenders to authorities. And once he arrives at the courthouse, he and his lawyers will be met by a member of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office who will inform him he is under arrest. The 45th president will then be processed, meaning he will be fingerprinted and will have to fill out paperwork just as a normal defendant would. But we're told he will not be handcuffed and he will not take a mugshot. Mr. Trump will then enter the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse to stand before a judge and be arraigned. He has said that he will plead not guilty. If the case goes to trial, it could be months, even years away. So this is the early part of a lengthy process. Right now, the indictment of the former president is still officially under seal. During today's hearing, it will be unsealed, and Mr. Trump, as well as the public, will finally see the charges he is facing. Sources have indicated he's facing about 30 different charges related to document fraud, likely stemming from hush money payments paid to the adult film star Stormy Daniels in 2016 over an alleged affair the two had in 2006. We have a full team here of reporters and legal analysts to help us throughout this critical day. We want to go to Kristen Welker right now, who is outside the courthouse to set the scene for us. Kristen, good day.
Hi, Lester. Good day to you. The anticipation is really building here outside the courthouse. Throngs of protesters, those in support of the former president and those who are critical of him, have gathered at a nearby park as they await the arrival of the former president. Once he arrives, he will be processed in this building behind me. He's going to enter on this street, which you can see has been blocked off. This is called Hogan Place. He will go in. As you say, he will be fingerprinted, and then the legal proceedings will get underway. We will then all learn, presumably, what is in the indictment, the more than 30 counts that the former president is facing. This is an historic day here, Lester, and a lot of uncertainty legally about the path forward. As you say, it could stretch months, even years. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the politics of this as well. We have seen the former president's Republican rivals closing ranks around him. In fact, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene was here earlier today, as well as controversial Congressman George Santos, to show their support of the former president. But based on some of my conversations with sources, you could see some of the former president's Republican rivals start to sharpen their tone, because there is a concern about what happened in 2016, effectively, that Mr. Trump's Republican rivals didn't want to go after him until it was too late. So could that change? If there are more indictments, that strategy could change, Lester, but an historic day getting underway here in Manhattan.
All right, Kristen Welker, as we watch that motorcade, that convoy making its way to Lower Manhattan, I'm joined by our panel who have each been closely following this case. Hallie Jackson is our NBC senior Washington correspondent. Laura Jarrett is senior legal correspondent. Also with me, NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos. Laura, let me begin with you. Everyone wants to see that document, that indictment, once it's unsealed. The process, though, may be a little clumsy or slow.
Well, yeah, we don't know exactly when it will come out. Will it come out in the middle of the arraignment? Will it come out and not until that hearing is complete? We have reporting from our colleagues, Jonathan Dienst, that if, in fact, Trump's defense team hasn't seen it until they walk into that courtroom, they may ask for a brief moment to confer, to be able to evaluate it, because they haven't seen it, just like we haven't seen it, because it's still under seal. So that would be a sort of a delay, a little unusual moment there to watch for. Obviously, we don't have cameras in the courtroom. We have reporters there for us, so it'll be interesting to see whether, in fact, that takes place.
Danny, typically, would you see the affidavit, I'm sorry, not the affidavit, the indictment handed over to the defense and to have them be given time to go over it?
Ordinarily, this is where the defense gets the indictment. Now, do they normally get 15 minutes to go into a special room and look at it? No. Depending on the jurisdiction, they might only have a few seconds to look at it. But because an arraignment is really not a substantive hearing, it's just charges, rights, bail, and housekeeping, scheduling possibly. So inconsequential is the arraignment that in some jurisdictions, Pennsylvania, for example, you can waive it. You can just mail in your not guilty plea, and you don't even have to go. It's significant because it is the starting gun for the criminal case. And after that point, you can get things like discovery. You can get the indictment, of course, which you need to get. But in terms of an actual substantive hearing, normally we're talking 5, maybe 10 minutes. If you're in some jurisdictions, they do it conveyor belt style, many defendants in the same room on one day. Of course, that's not what is happening here. Reportedly, they've closed down most of the courthouse for a single arraignment, normally, as I said, just a few minutes long.
Hallie, give me your thoughts as we await the arrival of the former president.
Well, I'm picking up on something Danny talked about here, and Laura too, which is this is a fairly quick legal proceeding. We had been watching, and we're seeing it here, that aerial shot of the motorcade. And let's just set the scene for what we expect to see happen over the next hour. We are not going to see much of Donald Trump. That is the expectation right now, because the judge has ruled that there are no video cameras in court. There will be some still cameras permitted, so we will have some, frankly, historic images of the former president.
But that would be only
just before the proceedings happen. I wouldn't underestimate, though, the power of a compelling visual, especially for somebody like Donald Trump, who made a lot of his career on understanding the power of an image here. What we're seeing now, let's just be clear. Lester, you or I couldn't get downtown as quickly as Donald Trump is getting downtown. The level of security that is in place around this is, frankly, extraordinary, and it is unprecedented because this situation is unprecedented. A lot of eyes on this. There's a lot of attention on this. As Laura and Danny have laid out, there are going to be things that will happen that don't typically happen for your run-of-the-mill defendant. At the same time, this is somebody who is facing criminal charges, Lester, and that is not to be forgotten.
Let me bring in NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Chuck, everything is through a political lens. Certainly this is. There has been a prebuttal of the DA's case based on no knowledge, really, of what is in this case.
There has been. Look, I think that the Trump team has decided, and they made this decision honestly, he made the decision 5 months ago when he decided to become an announced candidate as early as he did. It was all about trying to game the politics of the legal threats he faced. He was hoping being an announced candidate perhaps might keep the Justice Department from being as aggressive in that investigation. But none of that has worked out. But of course, he views his best legal defense as a robust political stature, if you will. And so today it's pretty clear he is now trying to lean into this. He wants to send the message that not only does this not hurt him, it may strengthen him, at least if you have that view inside the Republican Party, and certainly his Republican opponents are going ahead and conceding that aspect of it. They're not going to sit here and pick at this. If anything, they're rallying around him on this one. Look, we're all in uncharted waters, so we consider, and none of us can pretend we know exactly how this is going to play out. But it's what could be a short-term gain. Over time, Trump has a way of sort of wearing out his welcome, even with his most ardent supporters. And so I certainly think one way I look at this is this. What voter who voted for him in 2016, didn't vote for him in 2020, is suddenly looking at all of this and thinking, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I will go back to supporting him. This is what I want. So I still don't buy that it ends up being helpful to him politically in the long term. But if it's about keeping control of the GOP, in that sense, this has been successful for him.
Hallie, you have a thought?
Well, he's already doing that, right? I mean, and Chuck well knows this. You look at where the poll numbers are just in the last few weeks that we've seen, and members of the Republican Party, the former president's base, they are rallying around him, and so are his Republican opponents in this race. We even saw that from one of his potential rivals, Tim Scott, this morning. We've seen it from Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence. They are, frankly, giving him some cover on this front. But as Chuck points out, I've spoken with one sort of top political operative here just in the last 12, 18 hours or so who suggested, hey, sure, having support of your base could be helpful in the primary and will be helpful in the primary, but how does it play in a general? That's a question that some of these Republicans, I think, are going to have to start to consider. Maybe not now, maybe not in a month from now, but down the road. I'm also wondering here, just to get back to some of the images that we're seeing, if we will see the former president stop and speak to those cameras that are there in Lower Manhattan. He is somebody who in many ways, as we know, covering him when he was in the White House, liked to stop and talk with cameras on the South Lawn, for examst, when he saw them. So that's something else.
And the cameras will be permitted in the hallway, we should note. Right. I also want to talk to the panel here a little bit about the Truth post that the former president made, Truth Social, in which he says it's a very unfair venue, referring to Manhattan, with some areas that voted 1% Republican. This case should be moved to nearby Staten Island, he writes. Would be very fair and secure location for the trial. Additionally, the highly partisan judge and his family are well-known Trump haters. I want to get your thoughts about that language, singling out the family, Laura. Could that be problematic, that kind of language? Might that lead to the judge asking for him to be quiet?
It's a risky move. And I talked to a bunch of former federal prosecutors who have appeared in front of Judge Merchan, who will be presiding over this. And they said, look, he runs a tight ship. He doesn't stand for any nonsense. He's fair. He's impartial. He has a well-regarded reputation. And it'll be interesting to see whether he issues sort of a warning, not a formal gag order in the first instance, but perhaps just putting the former president on notice that he's watching and everything that he is saying can be used against him. Or maybe he says nothing at all. Maybe the judge just decides, you know what, if he wants to speak, let's let him speak, and to not address it at all. The district attorney may also say something, obviously, given the number of threats against that office, the number of tweets and posts on Truth Social that we've seen. They may decide that they want to ask for a gag order. Or again, they may decide, you know what, let's just let a jury decide.
All right, the convoy has exited the FDR now in Lower Manhattan. They should be arriving momentarily. But Danny, I do want to get your thoughts on that Truth Social post. Did you find it at all disturbing or near a line?
Disturbing, but here's the thing. Yes, the judge can entertain a gag order. He has the power to do it, but it always implicates First Amendment concerns. And not just any ordinary speech. Almost everything Trump says is political speech, which is especially cherished under our Constitution. So the judge is aware of this. So I'm thinking that this is something that neither side would even want. Trump doesn't want a gag order. He wants to be able to speak. If you're the DA's office, I don't think you want a gag order either. Let Trump go out there, tweet silly things, print them out, put an exhibit tab on them, and use them when you need to. A good example of that is Trump's tweet, January 6th, will be wild. Look how much that has been used against him as evidence. If the DA's office really wants him to get himself in trouble, they will not push for a gag order. And Lester, if the defendant says something that is threatening to the judge or the DA's office, there's a fix for that. It's a crime. Go out, arrest him, charge him with a new crime.
All right, we're looking at the the convoy now pulling its way through Lower Manhattan. Some people on the sidelines there watching, but not throngs necessarily. Keep in mind they have blocked off parts of this area to other vehicular traffic now to give the little buffer zone. This is nowhere near the size of a typical presidential motorcade that we're used to. This is more akin to what we see in Manhattan during the UN General Assembly when they're escorting various heads of state around town. Let's go to Kristen Welker right now, who is stationed in front of the courthouse. Kristen, will the crowd you're near, will anyone actually see this motorcade?
Yeah, so it hasn't passed by. It's actually...
You know, Lester, a number of people can see the motorcade. The protesters who are gathered in that park that I mentioned near the courthouse are somewhat offset. So right now, it's a bit somber and silent here. What we are witnessing right now is an extraordinary moment. The first president
Okay,
of
actually,
US
I'm going to interrupt you a second and show you. There is former President Trump waving to a few people as he's led through a flank of Secret Service and court police. See the back of his head now as he makes his way to the courthouse. Former President Trump now inside the courthouse, where he will now face the process of surrendering and arraignment. And Danny, you were saying this is normally a rather mundane process.
We're talking about a couple minutes. I mean, it happens very quickly. It is significant because it heralds the beginning of the case itself. But Lester, going back to something you mentioned before about Trump's tweet, he also talked about getting the case to Staten Island. Oh, what a huge win that would be for Trump. And it raises a really fascinating issue about whether Trump can indeed get a fair trial
And we should mention
in this county.
Staten Island tends to politically lean red.
Well, what's fascinating is that most of these, you're right, and what's fascinating is most of these motions that argue that, hey, I can't get a fair trial in this jurisdiction, almost all of them fail. There's maybe a handful that succeed. Going back to the Supreme Court Shepard v. Maxwell, that was the basis for the story The Fugitive, the film and the TV show. That's how far back it goes and how rarely this happens. But interestingly enough, this could be the case. Has there ever been a case that will have this much notoriety, the prosecution of a former president? But even if the judge were to grant this motion, then what next? Where do you send it? There's a general but not hard rule that you send the case to an adjoining county. But consider the counties around here in Manhattan that make up New York City. If you send the case to Queens or the Bronx, he's in worse shape than he is in Manhattan. How do I know that? Well, normally, you really don't have any hard science. But with a former president, you have plenty of hard science. You have election data. And all you have to do is go take a look, and you can get a loose idea of how popular Trump is in Manhattan with numbers. Something like 88%. You folks are more qualified to talk about this than I. But something like 88% of people in Manhattan voted for Joe Biden. But if you go to the Bronx, the number is almost the same, maybe even worse. But oh, what a difference if it heads over to Richmond County, commonly known as Staten Island. There, Trump won. Much better than 50-50. I think it was like 57%. So if you're the judge and you're entertaining this motion, you're actually thinking about granting it, where do you send it? There's nothing in the statute that tells you where it goes. And I have to tell you, Lester, if granted, this would be the case. This would be win or lose. This case somehow ended up in Staten Island, Trump wins. This case stays in Manhattan or gets moved to Queens. Just the numbers tend to show this is not a Trump favorable jurisdiction. In fact, it's probably the strongest thing the DA's office has in its arsenal against Trump is the jury pool right here in Manhattan.
All right, that's the picture we saw just a few minutes ago, the former president making his way into the courthouse. Jonathan Dientz is our legal justice contributor. Jonathan, give us an idea of what's happening now and when we might see him next.
Okay, so we were told that the prosecutors in this case were going to meet him at the entrance where he walked in at 1 Hogan Place and bring him upstairs for this processing. We may get a glimpse of the former president entering the courtroom. There is a pool camera that's been situated. There's a back elevator, and there's about a 5 to 7 step walk from that elevator into that courtroom. There is a camera in that hallway that may pick up the president going into that courtroom. And we may get some still photos early on from a pool still camera that is allowed in to film the very initial part of this hearing. And that's all we're going to see. Then the judge is kicking the cameras out. He is not allowing cell phones. He's not allowing laptops. There is no communication allowed out of that courtroom while the hearing is underway. So we won't find out what happened inside court until it is over and after President Trump has left the building. The security precautions in this building have been extraordinary. They have shut down the state Supreme Court hearings in this building as of noon today. They went in for a third time in the last 24 hours, conducting bomb sweeps and security checks to make sure there's no possible threat to the former president or any of the participants. There's been ramped up security for the prosecutors, for the judge. The number of unsubstantiated threats that have been hurled at this district attorney's office, at this court, that the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, the NYPD intelligence, that they've been monitoring over the last couple of weeks since we first reported that security was being ramped up and preparation was underway for the grand jury to act. It has been hundreds and hundreds of threats that have been filing in. So the security precautions, understandable, and understandable why the president had what amounted to from 1:09 p.m. when he left Trump Tower, he made it down to and walked into that building at 1:24. That's 15 minutes. On a normal day in New York City, you're lucky if you make it in 45 minutes to an hour.
Well, we may or may not see him in front of that camera shortly, but apparently he is still communicating via Truth Social. Let's go to Kristen Walker. Kristen, what do you know?
Lester, this was posted just moments ago from the former president on his Truth Social website. Let me read it to you. He says, heading to Lower Manhattan, the courthouse seems so surreal. Wow, they are going to arrest me. Can't believe this is happening in America. MAGA in all caps. This is significant, Lester, because it is consistent with the line of attacks that we have seen from Mr. Trump against this entire process. This is consistent with the line of attacks we have seen from his other GOP rivals, really trying to make the case that this is a political persecution against the former president. But look, I spoke to a source close to the former president who said to me, the president sees this as a really tough couple of days. Let's not forget, yes, politically speaking, he is using this moment to try to galvanize his supporters and his base, but he is still facing an indictment, some 30 charges that we are waiting to see what exactly they are. And so this is a moment that clearly, if you look at this Truth Social post, if you look at all of his posts, has really hit him in a very deeply personal way as well, even though he is aiming to capitalize on this moment politically, and so far has done so. His poll numbers expanding in recent days, Lester.
All right, Kristen, thanks. Hallie, I know we can't get into his head, but reading that post, does it make you wonder if he's thinking of the public, the people who will read that post, as part of his defense team? Part of a shield?
You're talking about the court of public opinion, if you will. I think that's right. And because I think that at this point, it is in some ways the only strategy that Donald Trump has left here, other than the legal strategy, is to put out posts like this. I mean, surreal. I think a lot of people might agree with that, even those who sit on the other side of the political aisle from where he is on this moment, given the historic nature of where we are, seeing a former president for the first time be indicted. I mean, waving as he's walking into a courtroom in New York City. It is a significant moment here in the arc of Donald Trump. So when he says it is surreal, I think that is channeling a lot of what he and his advisors think. Now, listen, they are looking to make some political lemonade out of this legal lemon, if you will, by turning this around and going on offense. Some of that, the question has been raised, is it bravado to a degree? The way that there is this sense where his attorney's going out on cable news, on television quite a bit, talking about how they feel confident they're going to win this case, talking about how they feel confident that the judge will rule in their favor. You also have some Republicans. Now, listen, John Kasich is no friend of Donald Trump, right? He has long been a never Trumper, but he is suggesting, and he is one of a few voices in the Republican Party who's suggesting that this is going to be politically problematic, not just for Donald Trump, but for the entire Republican Party a year and a half from now.
All right. Let me go to NBC News correspondent Ron Allen right now. He's also downtown, where Trump supporters and protesters have gathered. What does that look like? Ron?
Lester, there are hundreds upon hundreds of people here, protesters for and against former President Trump, passerbys, media. It's been quite a carnival atmosphere since early this morning when the crowd started growing and getting louder and louder. And over here, you can perhaps see there's a barricade that separates. One side is against Trump, and the Trump side is on this side of the barricade. And there have been police walking back and forth through that area that's about 6 or 7 feet apart throughout the day. It's been peaceful, a lot of yelling and screaming, but we have not seen any sort of physical confrontations. We've not seen any arrests that have happened as of yet. Again, the Trump crowd has been on this side. It seems to be thinning out a little bit. They seem to sort of disperse after hearing the helicopter and seeing reports on social media and elsewhere that, in fact, Trump had arrived at the courthouse. They obviously can't see him from here. The other big moment here was when Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congressperson from Georgia, showed up. The park where she was going to have a press conference where all these demonstrators are was so crowded that she couldn't get in. And she made some remarks on a side street just outside of this park because that was the safest place for her to go, where she could get some space, frankly. Again, it's been very peaceful, very passionate on both sides of this issue. And as you can imagine, they've been waiting and waiting for Trump to get here, hoping to get a glimpse of him. But from this vantage point, they won't. And the NYPD presence, the New York Police Department presence, is huge. A lot of officers in blue, a lot of plainclothes officers, but it is orderly, it is under control, and there is a lot of passion on both sides of this here. Lester?
Yeah, that picture qualifies as a wall of blue there. We see the police officers on the street right now. With us, joining us now, former U.S. Attorney at NBC News legal analyst Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, we're probably moving very quickly here. We don't still know what's inside this indictment, but if we can just look ahead a little bit, this question of change of venue and whether you can get a fair jury who doesn't know anything about this case or this individual. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I absolutely think you can get a fair jury in Manhattan, and let me explain that, Lester. You're not necessarily looking for a jury who doesn't know anything or doesn't have any opinions. As an example, I was a United States Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia when we tried a 9/11 conspirator in Alexandria, Virginia, 3 miles from the Pentagon, and we assembled a fair jury. Again, folks on the jury had heard of 9/11, of course, and maybe even had known of somebody who lost somebody in that horrific attack. What you're looking for are jurors who will listen to the judge's instructions, follow the law, and fairly and carefully weigh the evidence deduced in trial. Last count, Manhattan has a fairly sizable population, several million people. Can you find a jury of 12, whether or not they voted for Trump or against Trump or have an opinion about Trump, can you find a jury of 12 who can fairly and dispassionately weigh the evidence? In my experience, jurors do that all the time. For people who haven't been in the criminal justice system, they ought to know how seriously jurors take their oath and how seriously they take their work. I think the motion is likely to fail if it's filed by Mr. Trump, and I manifestly believe that he can get a fair trial and a fair jury in Manhattan. By the way, both sides, not just the defendant, but both sides are entitled to a fair trial, and I believe Judge Mershon will see that that happens.
All right, Chuck, we'll ask you to stand by. Thank you. And a reminder, Donald Trump just arrived at the courthouse for processing. So here's a look at what is happening right now. It's pretty standard stuff, as it's been explained, for anyone charged with a crime. He'll be met by a member of District Attorney's team who will inform him he's under arrest. That has likely happened already. Mr. Trump will be given the standard Miranda right warnings, which includes his right to remain silent. There's the paperwork that has to be filled out. He apparently will be fingerprinted. The big difference for him, no handcuffs, no mugshot. That would be part of the routine booking for anyone else. I want to move now, if I can bring in Catherine Christian. She worked in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for more than 30 years, including as an assistant DA, and has witnessed many defendants being processed. I want to ask you how this one is different, but first, if I can ask you about this idea of how lengthy this process is going to be from here on out. How long typically would a case like this take to get to trial?
It could take a year. No one should be surprised that a case which has, we haven't seen the indictment, but apparently over 30 counts, would take that long. You also have to remember, this is not the only case that's being prosecuted in Manhattan. It's also not the only case on Judge Mershon's calendar. There are incarcerated defendants who certainly should have their cases tried first, but there should be no surprise that a case like this that's complex would take long. The defense attorneys are going to file motions, as they should, because they're competent, and it's going to be about dismissing the indictment. They may have change of venue, which I agree with the panelists will fail. They are going to litigate to the max, as they should. And so people should not be surprised that a case like this could take up to a year.
That's an extraordinarily long amount of time, and we know that there's a DA in Georgia that may be close to deciding on an indictment. We know that there is a special counsel investigation. What happens if any of those indict and this is still going on? Who takes precedent? Which trial takes precedent? Who resolves differences in scheduling?
Well, typically, there are other defendants in that courthouse who have been indicted in other jurisdictions and have cases in other jurisdictions. Typically, whichever case is closest to trial will be the one that goes first. So Georgia hasn't even presented their case to a grand jury yet, so there is no indictment. The special counsel, there is no criminal case yet. And of course, he has a civil fraud case a block away from that courthouse, which is going to be going to trial probably before this one. And then he has the civil rape case that's going to trial. So he has a lot of legal issues swirling in his world. But typically, it's whichever case is, the lead. And that's how it happens.
I'm hung up on that year-long process we may be looking at. All that time, presumably, Alvin Bragg's office is not talking about the case.
Only in the courtroom are they talking about the case.
Yeah, only in the courthouse, so which makes me wonder, are they also know there's a court of public opinion. They also know this has been, widely attacked based on what people know, or maybe in this case don't know. How does that affect how this office proceeds?
I think that if this case drags along unnecessarily, I can tell you it will not be because of the Manhattan DA's office, and I'm not saying that as being biased. The defendant has a right to make motions and after motion, not frivolous motions, but motions. This judge, Judge Merchan, is a no-drama judge. He is very fair and reserved. He will not allow any unnecessary delays. He'll allow necessary delays, but not unnecessary delays. So every time there's a court appearance, the district attorney's office will have their prosecutors there, and they will make whatever record in the courtroom. So it will be clear that as this case is moving along, they are doing everything they're supposed to be doing. And if there's a delay, it has absolutely nothing to do with what they're doing.
Catherine, great to have you along with us today. We'll ask you to stand by as I turn back to our panel here. And Laura, let's begin this conversation now. But what might be in this indictment? We have heard that it could be up to 30. We don't know how it will be broken down, and if there will be any surprises, things that have not been reported.
That's one of the big questions we all have once we actually see the document is what is their theory of the case, and is there anything there that's new? Is there any fresh evidence? We understand they subpoenaed a number of different records. They had a number of different witnesses in front of this grand jury. That's all under seal. It's all supposed to maintain a secret process to protect the integrity of the investigation. And so I'm looking for in that indictment, is there anything other than a falsification of business records charge? Is there a conspiracy related charge? Is there banking? Is there tax fraud? We know that his former chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, actually pled guilty to tax fraud and falsifying business records, the very issue that we think is at the center of this case. And so we need to see sort of how do they explain their theory of the case and what's their legal hook. We've talked for days about how normally this would be a misdemeanor charge, right? How are they going to elevate it to a felony? What's their hook there? You need to have the intent to commit or conceal a second crime in addition to the falsification. So what's their theory for how you get there?
Would there be a conspiracy perhaps charge?
There could be. We don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. But if that's the second crime, maybe that's their hook.
All right. Danny, what are your thoughts? We don't know exactly when we're going to see this document.
Reportedly, it's going to be related to the Stormy Daniels hush money payments. But I just can't believe that would be the only thing that they would base this historic indictment on is those hush money payments, because they're problematic. This case is going to be problematic. That's not just my opinion. That was the opinion of one volunteer district attorney, Mark Pomerantz, who left the DA's office and this team out of frustration with the way things were going. And in his book, you see not only his position, which is that Trump should be indicted, but other people in the office pushing back and arguing that he shouldn't be indicted. And in his book, just to give you an idea, this Stormy Daniels Avenue, this hush money payments, this was called the zombie case because it died. It was reanimated. It came back to life. It shuffled along. Then it died again. This was a case that was not very promising. There are other cases, other potential charges that we may see. For example, Trump's statements of financial interest or condition that he submitted to banks in order to secure loans, or that maybe he deflated the value of his properties when it came time to pay taxes. We may see tax charges. We may see all of these coming, or even related to the Stormy Daniels hush money payments. But I have to say, and I'm probably in the minority, I would be surprised if the only thing in this indictment is 30 plus counts that are related only to Michael Cohen's paying off of Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump's reimbursing of Michael Cohen. There are a number of different challenges that case will have, and I would be surprised if the Manhattan DA's office didn't turn to some other counts, other charges, other theories of responsibility.
The former president's own attorneys have referenced the book that Danny is talking about here by somebody who used to work on this case and on this series of cases in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office as a way of pre-budding legally and previewing the legal defense they will put up. There's also another way that they're going to try to go after this case, and that is to attack the credibility of somebody who has been a central witness, who has appeared in front of this grand jury we know repeatedly, and that is Michael Cohen, who was considered a kind of fixer, the former attorney for former President Trump. You have seen now for weeks, ever since, frankly, even before word of this indictment started to come down, the former president's team, his attorneys, his legal team go after Cohen's credibility, go after the fact that Cohen, they say, is a proven liar and his word should not be trusted. So we are already seeing some of the preview of the legal defense, even if it is, Danny, to the point that you're making, only related to these alleged hush money
Let me
payments.
just direct you guys. We just had a picture up there. That is the, I think we told you about a camera that was going to be available in the hallway. Jonathan Deans is here. Jonathan, the former president will have to pass through in front of this lens?
So they'll pass through, but the courtroom, I believe, is behind those blacked out windows. So he's going to come out of the elevator bank, make a quick turn, and go into the back corner courtroom if that is still the 15th floor courtroom that they are using. So as you see, that is the pool camera that has been positioned front and center for all news media to share. And so it'll be a very quick shot of the former president going into that courtroom.
If he wants to say anything, he could walk to that stanchion.
He can, and we were told they are preparing for that possibility, but we are hearing from the defense side that there is no plan for him to speak at the courthouse, that they plan to leave right away, get to LaGuardia Airport. He wants to get back to Florida as quickly as possible to prepare for his primetime 8:15 p.m. speech, announcement, press conference to talk about what has happened today.
All right, let me ask you about these indictments and the way that they are made available to not only the counsel, but to the media. You've covered a lot of trials in that courthouse. How does that typically work? How long before we might see something and have it in our hands?
Really, right now, because of the way the judge has restricted access and the way the court works, you have to get hard copies from the clerk's office after the hearing. It takes a while. So we're at the mercy of the district attorney's office right now to email us the hard copy of the charging document, which traditionally in Manhattan is a very basic listing of the charges with a paragraph or two of explainers. I would expect in this case a more detailed indictment, but I don't expect something that we often see out of the federal courts where you have an indictment that's 80 pages long with extensive detail of the alleged crimes. So we are at the mercy regarding the email. The folks in court aren't going to know because they're most likely not going to read the indictment out in open court. There'll be some highlights of the main charges. There'll be some back and forth on the calendaring of the next court hearing, which is probably in May or June, as the whether there'll be any admonishment from the judge regarding public statements regarding this case, all to be determined. And Garrett will be in the courtroom. Melissa Russo of WNBC will be in the courtroom. There are 60 seats for reporters in the actual courtroom, 200 seats in the overflow rooms. But it's going to be a little while before we see the actual document. We're at the mercy of the DA, and when they press send on the email or post on
or scan it,
or
even bother if they have a scanner in the courthouse.
That massive sigh you just heard, by the way, all my legal friends here, like, how long?
Checking,
really?
we don't have it yet.
Right. It's just not the New York court system, the way it's set up. It's just not, it's not PACER. It's not the federal system or some of the other state systems. It is a bit slower, and because the judge has not allowed cameras in and he's not allowing any sort of communication from the courtroom itself during the hearing, we're going to have to wait till after the hearing is over to hear from the reporters who were there to tell us what happened, and then we're going to have to wait for the DA to email out, and usually they email it as soon as the hearing ends. So that's when I would expect the email to come, because to date, the district attorney's office has been following what he does in other cases, he's doing in this case, which is, I'm not unsealing early, even though there's enormous public interest, even though the court was on standby the day the indictment came by, that they were willing to entertain a motion from the DA to unseal right away. The DA said, no, I am going to handle this like any other case, and they wait until the defendant appears in court then literally the unsealing, the envelope gets handed to the judge and or the clerk, and it gets taken out, and now it is public. And that's when this document first becomes public in that Manhattan courtroom.
Obviously, he is getting special treatment. Is that a requirement of security, or were there negotiations between his lawyers and the court or Secret Service or whomever?
Look, he is the former president of the United States. He is surrounded by Secret Service agents. So is he a flight risk? He's the most recognizable man on the planet. So there's no need for a mugshot at this time. Whether they changed their mind when he came in, and the capability we were told was put in place. Originally, we were told it may not have been in place. It was made to be put in place in case they changed their mind. But in terms of special treatment, much of what we're seeing today is for the security reasons associated with this case, both for, again, the president and the judge and the DAs and the surrounding community, to make that building a fortress, to make sure it is safe and secure for everyone involved, and to get the president in and out, former president in and out as quickly as possible. So that is the logic certainly behind the court officers, the Secret Service, the NYPD, and everything you've seen in terms of, quote, special treatment. The logic, again, you have to go back. There have been a ton of threats, unsubstantiated, but a ton of threats associated with this case so far.
I want to bring in, if I can, former federal prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb. Carol, good to have you. Let's talk about this, what we expect to be, almost over 24 counts against the former president. Is there a strategy here that we're not seeing just based on that information?
I think there could be, and I agree completely with Danny that I would be very surprised to see this indictment limited to just the hush money payments. The hush money payments in themselves may not actually be illegal, but it's all the falsification that goes around it. Up to this point, in doing the grand jury investigation with the grand jurors and forming the indictment, it has been the advantage to the DA, because the DA can take all of the information that the DA knows and can craft the indictment in such a way that as much evidence as possible is going to come in at this trial. So if a conspiracy is charged, if tax fraud is charged, if the McDougal hush money payment is charged in addition to the Stormy Daniels hush money payments, this enables the DA's office, the prosecutors, to bring in as much evidence as they want if it relates to charges that are actually in the indictment. One of the most important things that a judge has to rule on is what evidence comes in at trial. And if these events are actually charged in the indictment, if a broader case is charged, then the DA will have more latitude to get more evidence in at trial.
What are your thoughts on state tax charges? Is that the likely one that we would see that we haven't really talked about?
I think it's very likely that state tax charges are going to be brought in this case, and here's why. Because if state tax charges are brought, it moves away from these campaign finance charges that everybody is saying is unprecedented and uncharted waters. Prosecutors do not like uncharted waters. They like to know the guardrails around the things that they charge in their indictment. They want to know what courts of appeals are going to say about the way they charge the case. Tax charges, as we saw in the Trump Organization trial, are well-worn charges. People understand tax evasion. You saw it in the movie The Untouchables, go after them on the tax charges. So if there's good evidence that Donald Trump made instructions that impacted the filing of false tax returns, I think you're going to see those charges in this indictment.
Let me bring Hallie back into the conversation. Hallie, a lot of folks quickly, mostly on the right, jumped to the former president's defense based on, a little bit.
What was publicly reported.
What was publicly reported, which, regrettably was not as much as we would have liked to have seen. If these charges turn out to be a bit more serious, does that change the calculus here?
I'd be surprised to see that, Lester. I mean, who knows, right? But I think given what we have seen, if past is any precedent, there is a real sense, and I will tell you, having spoken with a lot of Republicans here over the last series of days, that this almost feels kind of personal. that there is a sense, even among rivals of Donald Trump, members of the Republican Party, who may not want to see him get the nomination, certainly don't want to see him get the nomination considering they're working for somebody else, but who do feel like he really is being politically persecuted here. Now, we have to say that Alvin Bragg has pushed back on that. And the prosecutor's office has said, of course, that that is not the case here. But that sense is real given the person and the district bringing the case. Remember, and I want to just remind people, this is not the only investigation. This is not the only legal trouble, potentially, that Donald Trump faces. There is another investigation into him in Georgia in Fulton County as it relates to his push to try to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election there. There is also a special counsel case as it relates to what he did leading up to and on January 6th, as well as, and this is important, those classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago. And I think there is a sense that, and you're seeing some of these investigations here on screen, with, by the way, new developments, even just in the last couple of hours on the special counsel case, with a setback for the former president's legal team here, losing an appeal to get certain aides to testify. The classified documents case is one to watch as well, because these are Republicans who are running against him or who plan to run against him who have made a case about, let's say, national security, the importance of protecting intelligence. I think point being, other cases may be harder for Republicans to defend. But in this instance, unless there is some big bombshell, unless Danny is right and there is this sort of thing that nobody expects that comes out, it is hard pressed to see how, for example, Ron DeSantis or Mike Pence walk back the criticism that they've already very clearly and in some instances repeatedly laid out against Alvin Bragg in this investigation.
All right, let's bring in our colleague Kristen Welker now. She's outside the courthouse. Kristen, you have some thoughts about this too, about these gathering legal storms over the former president.
Well, right, and it has to do with the B word, Lester, baggage. I spoke to a number of Republicans who said, look, if the former president does face more indictments in those investigations that Hallie just laid out, you might start to see the conversation shift to that term baggage. Remember what the strategy was of Mr. Trump in 2016 against his rival at the time in the general election, Hillary Clinton. He made the case that she just had too much legal baggage to be president. So I think the question becomes, and some of the conversations are starting to swirl around whether that type of argument could be made against the former president if, in fact, there are more indictments. So I think that is a data point to watch. That is a moment when you could start to see the strategy shift among some of his GOP rivals, if, in fact, they start to shift their strategy. Another benchmark, Lester, I would look to the debates. That's a real opportunity for some of his rivals to really start to sharpen their tone, carve out their own lanes, and to depart from what we are seeing right now, which is this closing of ranks around the former president, this fear almost of breaking with him in this moment, Lester.
All right, Kristen, thanks very much. Joining us now is NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Chuck, give us your thoughts on this day. I sat in this same seat for two impeachments. January 6th, waiting for his statements on what was happening in the Capitol, and now we're here covering his indictment and his arrest. We will continue to talk about him going forward as we get closer to the 2024 election. How will he continue to shift the American electorate?
I don't know if he's going to continue to shift it. I think it's going to be a continued erosion. I'm glad you sort of focused it and reminded folks about how many times we've been in this moment where Trump's in a legal predicament, and it looks as if, and I think too often people assume, okay, this is it. This is the one that's going to get him, rather than realizing that, and I'll use a metaphor I've used in the past, when you watch the erosion take place on a riverbed, you don't always see it every day, but the erosion happens. And the fact of the matter is, since Donald Trump showed up in 2016, all he has done is lose support over time in the middle. Yes, these moments have rallied the base to his side, has made it impossible for the Republican Party to divorce itself from Donald Trump. But at the same time, we've seen him over time continue to sort of lose connection and lose trust with the middle of the electorate. How do we know this? The 2018 midterms, the 2020 presidential, the 2022 midterms. We can go on and on. There's also smaller elections in between. The fact of the matter is that each one of these, I think, drives more people away. And no one of these legal indictments is the political end of Trump. it's one of these that over time we're going to wake up one day and the emperor will have no more clothes, even among his base. Is that tomorrow? No. Is that a year from now? We'll see. Is it 5 years from now? Maybe. But that, I think, and each one of these over time, I mean, watch his Republican rivals. If he gets indicted on either of the other two, investigations in Washington and Atlanta, I don't think you're going to see the same rally around Trump that you're seeing now. In fact, I think in some ways, rallying around Trump now is easy because they know this is the one that's easier for them to politically dismiss. The next two will be harder, and I think it'll be harder for them to rally around Trump.
To Chuck's point, is it going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be in 5 years from now? Is it going to be next year? It's sure not going to be today because you're seeing, for example, a Republican Senator, Cindy Hyde-Smith, come out and endorse him and his 2024 run, making her the 6th senator now to endorse Donald Trump. In this campaign, more than 30 members of the House have also come out and endorsed Donald Trump already. So to the point that we're talking about here, it is certainly not today. TBD on whether it's a time down the road, but this isn't it.
Danny, I want to ask you, I don't know if we can put the picture back up of the former president walking in the courthouse earlier, but as I saw that picture, he turns and he waves, looking at the look on his face. You no doubt have represented clients who may feel pretty confident in their position.
Oh, yes.
But talk about that moment of reality when you walk in. Now, he didn't get the handcuffs, but he got the indignity of being walked in as a suspect.
And I suspect that's why Trump's team didn't want cameras in the courtroom. Trump loves cameras, but he can't control the narrative. And there's probably no worse look for somebody than standing at the defense table, even if you're just being arraigned and saying the words, not guilty. It's not a good look. It doesn't help him. That's why he's going to control the narrative, leave the courthouse, go back to home base in Florida, and then he'll make his statements. But, the interesting thing, there are a lot of different defendants out there for whom being charged with a crime isn't the devastating thing that it would be for everybody else. And for someone like Trump, he's someone that appears to be unbothered. It's water off a duck's back. So he's walking into court, he's waving, he's probably not going to give a statement here. But look, criminal courts, especially white-collar criminals, are the type that never believe that they did anything wrong. And the irony is they will tell their lawyers about how this is all a big misunderstanding and I didn't do anything wrong. They'll want to control the way the case goes, not realizing the irony that doing things the way they want to do it is what got them a case in the first place.
All right, we're looking at this picture now. This is Jonathan, 15th floor?
Yeah, 15th floor. So we just saw a moment ago, excuse me, Lester,
sure.
The members of the prosecution executive team come through the blacked out doors there from the elevator and go into part 59, which we believe is the courtroom that's going to be handling this. And we are awaiting the arrival, we believe, of the former president who will come up those back elevators, come through those doors and those few short steps into the courtroom for the hearing. Again, it's scheduled to start at 2:15 today, but again, it's unclear if it will start on time. It's unclear if and when the defense is going to be provided a copy of that indictment. Joe Tacopina, again, earlier said he may want some extra time with the defense team and with Mr. Trump to review those documents. So court officials have informed us there is a back room behind the courtroom that if they want a little extra time to go over the document and speak to Mr. Trump and converse about how they're going to handle this hearing, this 2:15 start, if it starts on time, could be delayed if that request is made.
And will part of this process be scheduling a new date, and what would that next date be for?
Well, some legal experts, Danny might know better than me, would say that this is months away. You're looking at a May, June return at best. Look, the defense has said right away they're going to file a motion to dismiss. They're going to file motions alleging the DA is biased.
Could that happen today?
No, they won't file the motion today.
Okay.
Under the rules, some motions have to be filed, I believe, within, I think it's 45 days. So, for example, within that 45 days, you might see a venue transfer motion. The strange thing about those motions is that courts in New York almost never deal with them. They would prefer to get to voir dire and actually the trial date to deal with that. But you will see some motions filed in all likelihood within 45 days of the arraignment, because that's the date that many motions have to be filed in the state of New York by the rule. So, yes, the next date is probably going to be something that is scheduled for a motions hearing, because you have a relatively short period of time. Once you notice that motion, notify the court and your adversaries that you're making a motion. The court will usually set a hearing date, or in New York, for example, sometimes the litigants, at least in civil court, can pick a date themselves, which the court may move around depending on scheduling. So, look, the court will accommodate dates for regular unknown litigants. They're certainly going to accommodate the wishes of these litigants because it's what they do anyway. And that goes for trial dates, too. A lot of folks are asking, when's the trial date? Well, I think the answer to that is, what do the parties want? Because I've had trials rescheduled because a prosecutor has a prepaid vacation. So it'll give you an idea that courts will accommodate dates that are important to the litigants. The key here is, what if Trump wants, for example, a trial before the election, and the DA's office wants it after the election? How do you split that difference? That's going to be a difficult dilemma for the court. It may be avoided if both sides want it either before or after. But scheduling in this case is going to be really critical, because we're not dealing with a prepaid vacation. We're dealing with a national election in just a few months. So believe me, both sides have huddled together and they've mapped out the pros and cons of scheduling this trial, whether it should be before or after the election.
But ultimately, though, it will come down, Danny, to what Donald Trump wants, because his legal team can huddle and discuss timing and scheduling as much as they'd like. But unless they have buy-in from the former president, we have seen him, frankly, blow up what his advisors have asked for in the past and declare that he wants something and push for that. And his team obviously works to try to make that happen. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see how the timing piece of it takes out, because you're right. We're talking about, listen, they're probably not going to shift it for a campaign rally or two, and we expect there to be plenty over the course of the next year and a half. But we are gearing up to be in the middle of presidential debates months from now. We're gearing up to be in this presidential election, Jonathan.
Okay, we're watching folks come in that back door leading, I guess, to the courtroom.
I think what you saw a short time ago, the court officers sort of have parted ways and made a clear shot for the camera. They are awaiting, we believe, the arrival of President Trump. We are told from a senior official on the floor there that this court hearing, as of now, is expected to start on time, right on time at 2:15.
That's
so certainly
10 minutes from now.
Within the next few minutes, we would expect to see Mr. Trump come through those doors and with his legal team to enter the courtroom. We're hearing from the defense side that it's only Mr. Trump and his defense lawyers, that we do not expect any Trump relatives in the courtroom today, but obviously to be determined. But that's the best information we have.
So based on that, let me turn to, if I can, Catherine Christian, who worked in the Manhattan DA's office. I just want to be very clear. At this point, based on what we know, is the former president formally under arrest?
Yes, but when I say yes, but typically a white-collar defendant who surrenders to the DA's office like he did is met by the investigators, is fingerprinted. He's not going to be handcuffed. Has a photo taken, and then is escorted into the courthouse. In this case, he's going to be escorted into the courthouse with his Secret Service contingent and also the investigators. So that's sort of the difference. A typical defendant will be escorted by the DA's office investigators. In this case, because he is a former president, it will be the Secret Service and also probably with the investigators. And then will be brought to court, and then his attorneys will be there waiting for him.
Often we see a judge routinely ask the defendant to surrender passports. Would that happen in a case like this?
I seriously doubt it, and I doubt the prosecutor is going to ask for it. Where in the world could Donald Trump go and no one know where he is?
Point well taken, but I had to ask. So Danny, this actual process, once he goes inside there will be his three attorneys. And this is not a thing where you normally have spectators.
No, I mean, normally courts are open, and arraignment courts are often conveyor belts. I mean, they're like an assembly hall in state court. Now, there's a huge difference between state court, which is like a public bus station full of people bustling around. When you walk into a federal courthouse, it's like a library. I mean, there's barely anybody there. So an arraignment there might be attended by nobody. In state court, you might have 50 people waiting for their case to get called, and it moves relatively quickly. That's not what's happening today. They have reservations for the entire building, cleared it out for this the most consequential defendant in the history of New York criminal law. So even for a hearing that's only going to be a few minutes, and by the way, the fact that they've cleared that building gives us a pretty good indicator of how this case is going to go procedurally for a really minor hearing. I hate to say minor because it is a significant point in the criminal case. But in arraignment, this much going on, what about when we get to motions hearings, jury selection? There are going to have to be so many precautions taken. You see all of those officers right there for what will amount to be a 5-minute procedure. I don't think we're fully realizing how significant this is going to be just in terms of planning, procedure, resources expended by the New York courts. You know, I think it was Jonathan or somebody that mentioned earlier that, look, this judge has other cases on his docket. Yeah, he kind of does, but not really. This has just become the most important case in this courthouse. And if you don't believe me, I'd venture to guess that there are some folks, and Jonathan, you may agree with me on this, there are some folks that are sitting on Rikers who originally had a court date today, and that may have been canceled, may have to wait until the next few weeks when they can get in, because this is the most significant arraignment in the history of arraignments.
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of activity there at the door. We're about a little over 5 minutes until the scheduled start of this hearing. Laura, let me ask you, will Mr. Trump be afforded an opportunity to speak at this hearing other than guilty or not guilty?
You know, usually that's pretty much all you would see at this point. He would rise. It'll be interesting to see whether he actually does the one to enter the plea. Does he do it on his own? Does he have it do it, you know, on his attorney's behalf? The other thing that's interesting is, you know, obviously the whole grand jury process is secret. Within 15 days, the state is required to turn over a whole bunch of material to the defense team that they have never seen before. The grand jury minutes, law enforcement's notes of all the witnesses that came in to talk. So even people who didn't appear before the grand jury. For instance, Stormy Daniels, if she just met with prosecutors or just met with law enforcement personnel, they'll be able to now see all of that information. All of the information that was subpoenaed. We're getting some more. There's Alvin Bragg entering the courtroom there, the district attorney.
Will Bragg, do we think Bragg will lead the prosecution here in this case?
I don't think so. I would be surprised if he actually does the presentation. I would venture to guess it'll be Susan Hoffinger, who's been sort of the lead prosecutor on this, or Chris Conway, or one of the other prosecutors, and probably not Bragg himself, but he wants to be there to support his team, to show, obviously, you know, his support for all their work.
He'll be there to speak afterwards, too. We will hear from him later on this afternoon,
right.
And we will also hear from Donald Trump in on a much friendlier turf. We've been showing some of those aerial shots of just the sheer number of people now who are outside that courtroom. Donald Trump is going to go back to Mar-a-Lago. He's going to basically, I believe, get on the plane fairly quickly after this is all wrapped up to get down for that primetime speech that he plans to deliver in front of, frankly, a lot of people who are there to back him and to sort of rally to his side in this moment.
Danny, have you had clients who want to say something beyond guilty or not guilty and have been allowed to?
Every defense attorney has had clients who want to say things, who think they understand and think that, and this is a very common feature with white-collar defendants. They think, and maybe you have relatives or family members that are like this too, they think if I can only get in front of the judge and explain this all away, it's all a big misunderstanding. If I can just get up there and tell my side of the story. And what they realize, what you have to explain to them is that this is not the way to do it. Not on a podium, and often not even on the stand testifying in your defense, because the reality is that is usually not a good proposition for a defendant. But you try to tell your clients not to say anything, not to talk to anyone. And whether it's Donald Trump at a podium or, far more often, Jonathan, I'm sure, knows this too, they get on the phone at the prison or at the jail and start making phone calls on a recorded line, and they hang themselves, figuratively, of course, in their own case. There is nothing more damaging, often, to a defendant's case than the defendant's own words, often after the case has been initiated.
And Hallie, the reason I raise it, of course, he's talked about a witch hunt. He was putting out social media, criticisms of this case, even as he was on his way to the courthouse. I'm wondering, he will have an audience of reporters in that courtroom if it would be unusual, out of place for him to say something beyond not guilty.
I think, to Danny's point, I think he will want to, knowing the way that he often wants to make sure that how he feels, gets a place in the sun, if you will. I do think, though, that at this moment, he has been listening to his legal team. In other words, he came up to New York and surrendered himself. I remember sitting here with all of you, I think a couple weeks ago, and talking about that being a question mark, frankly, when I guess it was a few days ago, when this indictment, news of this first leaked. He came up, he surrendered. He has been putting his attorneys out there. They've been doing the legal filings. I think his attorneys are advising him, if it's going to be him that says it, just say the words and then speak either outside in the hallways or wait to deliver these remarks when you get to Mar-a-Lago, essentially. Keep in mind that his campaign has made something like, they say, $7 to $8 million plus in just the 5 days since this news first broke. They are fundraising off of this. They are selling indictment swag, T-shirts with the date of the news that the indictment came out on it. I mean, this is something that they have seized on in a big way in the hopes that it will rev up their base.
All right, we're looking at that live picture of the 15th floor of the courthouse, where any moment now, former President Trump will make his appearance for his arraignment beyond those blacked out windows of the door there. He will enter his plea of guilty or not guilty. There will be reporters in the room, but as we've noted, they will not be allowed to carry any electronics, computers, or phones with them.
Well, Lester, one update that we just got from on the floor there, the court hearing is a bit behind schedule. So it could be a few minutes, it could be 10 minutes before the former president comes up and appears. So this 2:15 start time obviously is a few minutes behind. So we're hearing perhaps as much as 10 to 15 minutes before we see the former president. We had seen the district attorney, we've seen the executives with the Manhattan DA's office already go in and file in. But now we await the arrival of former President Trump and his defense team to come up that elevator, be escorted into the courtroom there, surrounded by the Secret Service. And whether that's in 2 minutes, 10 minutes, we are on hold waiting for that moment, because obviously the hearing won't begin until we see the former president go into court. And one other note, in terms of the extraordinary security that's going on here, you see the court officers lining the halls, everything has been cleared out in that courtroom. Inside the courtroom, in the aisle, the former president is going to walk down to go to the defense table. They have cleared 1 to 2 seats in every row so that there's no one in reachable range of the former president as he walks through the courtroom to get to his defense table. This on top of the we're seeing the security outside the courtroom. You can imagine the level of security inside the courtroom as well.
All right, let me go to a former prosecutor and NBC News legal analyst, Kristen Gibbons-Fedden. What's it like to prosecute such a high-profile defendant? You were obviously involved in the Cosby case.
Yeah, for the prosecutor, it's really no different than prosecuting any other crime. You follow the evidence and you follow the law. But with regard to all the media, it can be very, very confusing, and it can be very, crazy. But the important thing is that while there's a lot of chaos going on outside of the courtroom, inside of the courtroom, it is really routine. It's going to be an arraignment. One of the things as a prosecutor, and Danny kind of mentioned this earlier on, is there's going to be a lot of motions that you wouldn't normally see in everyday trials. You're going to see the defense attorneys really file motions with regard to change of venue. That was something that we saw in the Cosby trial as well. Statute of limitations, due process violations with the length of time that the investigation took. So you're going to see a lot of those motions, which are typically summarily dismissed, that will be pages and pages and pages of motions created by Trump's very prominent legal team. But one of the things to keep in mind is that even though there's a lot of chaos going around outside, it's going to be very routine in the courtroom.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, juries are obviously told not to read or follow news accounts of whatever case they're on, but do prosecutors follow what's written and what's being said about their case and adjust accordingly?
I think it would be best that they do. Mainly because every member of the jury are still human beings. And so members of the public who are giving their opinions about the way that the case is going, that's a really important opinion to consider, because if they're thinking that the evidence is not coming in as beautifully as the prosecutor thinks that it is, then perhaps they need to change what they're doing. Now, it is important to note that prosecutors generally do have an ethical obligation not to really create a narrative, not to taint any potential jury pool or create any issues that could be raised on appeal with regard to narratives out in the public. But unless there's a gag order there, the defendants don't really have that same obligation. So in the case of Trump, I would imagine, but specifically for the Cosby trial, there was a lot of public speaking, changing the narrative of what actually was going on in the courtroom. So when the prosecutor does listen to public opinion, they do have to be mindful that the jury is really only to consider what has been presented from the witness stand and not anything else that really wasn't presented, which may be part of the narrative.
I'm wondering if looking at this prosecution, if they would perhaps like to set lower expectations and over-deliver.
I always think that's really important. Definitely set low expectations, over deliver. And that is really the theme with anything, mainly because what you want to do is you want to follow the evidence and you want to follow the law. And by just mainly kind of stating what the case is all about and sticking with that, taking out any cloudiness, any red herrings, then you really do end up over delivering just by nature.
All right, Kristen, we're glad you're with us. Thank you. Let me just move on, if I can, to Kristen Welker, who's outside the courthouse. Kristen, what have you been hearing from people who are close to the former president about what we're witnessing today?
Well, Lester, I heard from one former aide to former President Trump who is still quite close to him, who said that the next couple of days are going to hurt still. He sees this case as a weak one. Another former staffer who has since broken with former President Trump had this to say, Lester: I think this must be a jarring and surreal moment for him. This is the most out of control he's been of a situation, his physical circumstances, in many years. You have to imagine the weight of this moment is hitting him. I raised that point, Lester, because I think it really underscores that this is uncharted territory for former President Trump as well, right? He has faced so many legal battles throughout the course of his lifetime, going back to his days in real estate here in New York, and yet none like this, none where he has actually been indicted. And so this is a new moment for him. Again, we are going to hear from him later on today, this evening, from Mar-a-Lago, where we expect to hear the defiant Mr. Trump. He's not just a former president, he's a former reality TV star who understands the power of these optics. But again, Lester, really uncharted territory for him, both politically and legally. And I think these former staffers really capture that moment, that this is going to be a challenge for him moving forward.
Yeah, we've been talking about what he may say or not say to an open mic in that hallway, but we do know he's going to speak tonight. He's planning a speech in the what would be considered the primetime viewing hours. Any idea what the thrust of that message will be?
Well, Lester, I think you can look to the former president's Truth Social post to get a sense of the tone that we are going to hear tonight. He has been defiant. He has lashed out at the DA, Alvin Bragg. So I anticipate we will hear more of that. And I anticipate that he's going to put this into what he believes is the broader context, something that Marjorie Taylor Greene said, that democracy is being destroyed. Those are the words of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and it really, I think, encapsulates some of the messaging that we have heard from Trump world. He will try to cast himself as being persecuted, that this is a political persecution. And again, I think he's going to use this moment to really try to rally his base, rally Republicans around him, to try to get them to close ranks even more than we have seen. Again, Lester, just a reminder, his poll numbers have gone up in recent days. This has only emboldened him in the primary so far, Lester.
All right, we should note that that speech will be carried on our streaming channel, NBC News Now, later this evening. Let me bring Jonathan back right now. Jonathan, are we going to hear from DA Bragg at some point?
Yes, at 3:30. That is the scheduled press conference. Of course, a lot depends on when this court hearing gets underway and gets completed. But he is planning a 3:30 press conference. And for those of us who have covered DA Bragg, he will stick within his comments, within what's in the indictment, and not stray too much. We have tried many a times on many other cases, and he is, a trained former federal prosecutor. And
but he has to know that he's already on the defense from much of the criticism we've heard the last several days.
He is certainly aware. I think he's going to outline these charges. I think he's going to explain to the best he can the rationale for bringing these charges and why they were brought now. But I don't think he's going to get involved in some of the extraneous conversations that were going to go on. He's going to address the what's in the indictment, and he has sort of engaged that way with the press to date.
And that's, by the way, a picture of him going into the courthouse earlier. Right. He does hold things close to the vest. That's a description I've heard many times of him. In talking to people who know him, do they think he would have gone for this if he thought that it was weak and the way it's been described as weak?
Look, he originally, remember all the controversy? He backed off when the line prosecutors, Mark Pomerantz and that team, felt they had a case and they were ready to move forward. Let's go. And he said, time out. Let's take a look at this. And, resulted in a lot of combat inside that office and some resignations. They went back. They took a hard look at this Stormy Daniels hush money payment issue that the Southern District of New York passed on. And important to note, that was passed on after Joe Biden was elected, after Bill Barr was out of office. And that Southern District, with that team of prosecutors who were a no-nonsense group by reputation, and from what I know about them, they chose not to go after this case in a federal indictment. They did not go forward. What Alvin Bragg has now, remember, he met with Michael Cohen 20 times. This grand jury has been meeting for weeks and hearing from, the publisher of the National Enquirer, a host of witnesses and documents. So there's a lot they know that we don't. And so we hope to hear a heck of a lot more at 3:30 from Mr. Bragg. And when we see that document, to sort of outline exactly the rationale and the charges that he brought forward here. But he is a cautious, careful man in something like this.
I do wonder if we will hear from him, though, Jonathan. The way that you describe it is he's not going to get into things that are extraneous, if you will. I mean, the very real threats against him, the threats that he has received, and this ties into something we were talking about with Kristen Welker as well on the speech tonight that Donald Trump will give at Mar-a-Lago. He has attacked the judge presiding this case, as we've discussed, as somebody who he says hates Donald Trump. Will he go after the judge again tonight? That is legally perilous for him, and there's a question on how much or if, right, the judge will address that in this arraignment here in the next couple of minutes.
Yeah, just a reminder what he said earlier in that Truth Social post, talking about his desire to go to a different venue, to Staten Island as opposed to Manhattan, very unfair venue. But he talks about the highly partisan judge and his family as well-known Trump haters. I guess what you're saying, it's hard to imagine him backing off that kind of a language here on the same day as the indictment.
But what if he's warned by the judge, knock it off, essentially, right? I mean, then how does he, it's tough to tell Donald Trump not to talk about something, right? But that may very well be a real possibility.
But if he's warned not to talk about it and then does deliberately disregard what the judge says, then I think you up the ante in a different way. And that's where I think the judge might be more inclined to actually issue an order about it. Everyone is saying, obviously there are free speech concerns. There's the fact that he's running for public office. If he deliberately ignores an admonishment from a judge to not talk about this case, because usually it's the defendant who wants to preserve the right to a fair trial. Usually it's the defendant who's asking for prosecutors not to talk, asking for the gag order. If he deliberately ignores what the judge says, I think that changes a lot in the minds of that judge.
You're right, and keep in mind that Donald Trump's own attorneys do not agree with his assessment of this judge. We've seen them try to clean that up and walk that back.
Although there's been a lot of debate in the legal community here in New York among the experts and those who've appeared before this judge. Will he or won't he? His former spokesman, the former spokesman for the court administration and who helped run that courthouse, was of the view this judge is not going to, quote, take the bait. David Bookstaver, in an interview yesterday, said, I know this judge. I can't imagine he's going to get involved in what Donald Trump is saying out there and on social media. Let him say what's going on out there. I'm going to handle what goes on in this courtroom here and be all business here and not get involved in that. There are other legal experts who say there is no way a judge will sit and tolerate this type of language being bandied about his court and or the prosecutor for that matter. And it'll be interesting to see if it's the judge, if it's the DA who bring this up at all, or if it just goes unaddressed today.
Let me bring into the conversation Chuck Todd. regarding the DA, regarding the kind of the history of this case. Chuck, you talked to Cy Vance this past weekend. What did he tell you?
I did, and he actually addressed this topic, and he said, look, he said he was issuing a warning to Trump's lawyers, saying they should put a warning to their client of not committing a criminal offense here in his criticism of the judge or the DA, because he could end up adding a charge. A charge could get added. He described it as an obstruction of governmental administration, which is essentially interfering with or threatening with you this. You throw that on top, and as he said, let me quote him, you could take what perhaps we think is not the strongest case. When you add a count like that, put it in front of a jury, it can change the jury's mind about the severity of the case that they're looking at. So the point he was making is that Trump's own lawyers ought to be warning Trump, the more you do this, the more this could happen, where the DA adds a charge, and that only hurts you with a jury at the end of the day if you actually care about your guilt.
Yeah, you mentioned the lawyers. We saw Joe Tacopina walk in, and here is the former president. There he is.
President Trump, will you come speak to us? President Trump?
Oh, that was just
Former President Trump with a stone face, acknowledging with a glance, a question shouted at him. We didn't hear the question, but then proceeding inside the courtroom without engaging. And so now begins the process of the arraignment.
And I can provide a bit of an explainer as what the delay was. Remember, this was set for 2:15. Yep. We are hearing from one source inside the courthouse that the prosecutors did give the defense an advance copy before today's hearing so that they could review the charges in advance of the hearing, so the hearing didn't start, and then they asked for a delay and then go into the back to have their meeting. So from one source,
that means it should be unsealed.
So that means it will be unsealed as soon as the judge takes the bench. It is customary in many cases that the DA's office will provide courtesy copies when defense lawyers or the defendant arrives to facilitate the movement. But again, that's just one source saying that is their understanding of what this 15-minute or so delay from the 2:15 start time was.
All right. Catherine Christian is still with us. She worked in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. You have been through this many times. Give us an idea of what will happen typically right now, how long this moment will take.
Well, it shouldn't, and if it is true what Jonathan said, that the defense were given a copy of indictment, that should make it a shorter proceeding, because they will have the opportunity, or they had the opportunity to review it, and they're not basically reviewing it as soon as it's handed to them in the well of the courtroom. So what you just saw Mr. Trump go in, that's typically how someone who is not, incarcerated would come in. They would just come in through the front doors, albeit not surrounded by Secret Service. And he will join his attorneys on one side of the courtroom. They call it in the well, at a table. I don't know if all 4 of his attorneys will be seated with him, but they might. And on the other side, directly on the opposite side of him, will be the prosecutors on the case. Probably not every one of them. The first row in all courtrooms are reserved for the attorneys. So on the one side, it will be the defense attorneys or people who are part of their firm will be behind Mr. Trump and his attorneys. And on the other side will be, if the District Attorney Bragg is not going to be personally doing the arraignment, he'll be seated right behind the assistant district attorneys who are assigned to the case. And the judge will be there, the chief, they call it the bridge officer, who's the court officer, the court clerk, the court stenographer. So the well will not be congested with a lot of people. The audience will be seated behind that first row of attorneys.
So in terms of scheduling, for future court dates, will the former president be required to appear in person?
He should not. For an adjournment for the defense to file their motion, and then there'll be adjournment for the prosecutors to respond, and adjournment for the decision. It's not necessary for him to be there to hear the decision of the court, and that's not getting special treatment. COVID has shown us that you don't have to appear unless it's a necessary proceeding. But anything like a hearing, he will have to be there.
I'm sure you heard part of our discussion earlier, the idea of statements and things that the former president might put out there on social media. Is that something the DA's office would typically, in a case like this, follow closely? What is being said, how it's being said, the tone of what's being said, and whether action is necessary?
Absolutely, because there are charges. There's inciting a riot, which arguably, he hasn't done yet. But, the more that his rhetoric, if he continues to put it up, out there on those posts or whatever he says tonight, harassment, making threats against someone, whether it's the judge or the prosecutors, they're going to be following everything that he says. And also, those are statements that will be used, guaranteed, against him during the trial. So if you're the attorney for Mr. Trump or any other defendant, you're always saying, just please keep your mouth shut. We know that's not going to happen here. But they will be following every word that he says, as the defense is following every word that Michael Cohen says when he goes on his press tour that he's been doing.
So where we are, if you're just joining us, former President Donald Trump surrendering himself to the New York Manhattan DA at a courthouse in Lower Manhattan today, formally arrested and now in the process of arraignment. He stepped into the courtroom just a few minutes ago with his lawyers. As it's been explained to us, a rather straightforward and not lengthy process as he goes through the official processes of becoming a defendant, and it becomes the state of New York versus Donald Trump. As I've said, the process itself should not take long, and his plan, as we understand it, is to go back to LaGuardia Airport and make his way to Mar-a-Lago, where he will speak tonight in remarks that he had previously scheduled and had advertised. But again, we saw him a few minutes ago going into the court, very stern, stone face, as I would describe it. A question was put to him. He gave a acknowledgement of a glance and then looked forward and exited into the courthouse itself. Allie, you want to talk about this moment in history?
Well, it is a moment in history, right? Yeah. It's a couple of things strike me here. First, it is that the universe of people who now know specifically the charges against Donald Trump has just expanded, based on the reporting from Jonathan Dienst, that his defense team now knows what specifically he is being charged with. If it is, as Laura has talked about, a felony, what the underlying charges are, what the underlying intent to commit another crime has been, they are now read in on that. They are now aware, which means Donald Trump is now aware. And I think that is important context for the moment that we have just shown and that we have just played here. I think it is going to be, I don't know for sure, I saw some what looked like still photographers come out of the courtroom just a minute ago, which makes me think any minute now we will likely see some of those first images from inside the courtroom of a former president being arraigned for crimes and on these charges, whether you think they're serious or not, whether they are going to be politically challenging for him or not, or perhaps politically helpful. It is still a significant moment, even given all the history that we have seen of this former president before and during his time in the White House, Lester.
Chuck Todd, let me bring you back into the conversation. We have all, as I noted, we've all sat here and covered moments of history involving Donald Trump, and to watch him make his way into that courthouse with the look on his face, the seriousness, obviously, of the moment impressed upon him. What were your thoughts?
Well, look, I mean, we say the phrase all the time, nobody's above the law, not even our presidents. And yet we had never seen this happen. Other democracies have put their presidents on trial. Other democracies have put former presidents in jail, including Israel, including France. But there is something fitting that the first time that this former president faces a criminal charge, it's in his hometown, and it's in New York City. In many ways, if you follow Donald Trump for most of his adult life, his whole goal was to become well-respected, to be the man in New York City, and he was able, in many ways, to become famous and to become infamous, but he never got the respect he always demanded. He ran for president hoping that would break through, that the elites of New York, the elites of Manhattan would embrace him, the elites of Washington would embrace him. That's never going to happen, so of course he's taken this other direction and has gone in this different place. But at the end of the day, the former president's been arraigned. He's been arrested. The country is still standing. I think it is a reminder of the strength of our institutions. We sit here and talk about how weak they are or how unpopular they are right now. I do think that this is a day that we ought to remind ourselves that whatever you think of these institutions, they're working as intended. He's going to get as fair of a trial as is possible under these circumstances, and the chips are going to fall where they may.
Danny, how do you feel about the health of the rule of law as it's perceived and faith in the rule of law, and whether this kind of thing, does erode some of that?
Law for lawyers is our faith in some sense. I mean, it governs not just our profession, but we're governed by rules of ethics. And so I think every lawyer, as much as we criticize the system, and I have plenty of complaints about courthouses and the fact that they're not very tech savvy, and I can make all kinds of complaints about the fact that, why don't we have this indictment right away? Well, I've been in a lot of courthouses. Jonathan has too. Laura has too. They're not the Apple Store. They probably don't even have many scanners on each floor. So I have plenty of complaints about how the system works, but I do believe in it. I believe it's the only thing that we have, the thing that separates us from other countries, other places that don't treat the accused as well as the United States does. And in fact, that often is, me included, part of my closing argument at a trial, that we do live in a special place. And we empower 12 peers, sometimes more, sometimes less, 12 peers, regular folks in society, to come in and stand in judgment of another person, another citizen.
I'm told we had the first photo from inside the courtroom, and keep in mind this would be prior to the actual beginning of the arraignment. There you see former President Trump somewhat slumped over at the desk, appearing as a defendant.
And he's there with, by the way, his attorneys, obviously, including somebody who was just brought on within the last 24 hours, somebody who knows this district, Manhattan, well, somebody who understands what it's like to the charges and what it's like to defend a high-profile defendant, Paul Manafort.
Yeah, obviously, the former campaign chairman he represented for a time in front of a New York jury, and obviously those cases were dismissed, but he's a former federal prosecutor. He's the one right there on the left-hand side who's just joined the team, Todd Blanche, represented Paul Manafort on falsifying of business records charges, which is one of the issues we believe at the center of this case as well.
And so as we look at this picture, we may get more. I think 5 photographers were allowed in the courtroom.
So it was for the preliminary part of this hearing. He's seated. They were going to go in, take their shots, and with an extraordinary photo. And then they were told to leave. And as soon as they left, the hearing was going to begin. And the guidance we got was the hearing was going to go about 15 minutes or so. And then Donald Trump will be walking out of court and go down the elevator. And why haven't we heard anything about what's happening inside that hearing? Again, no cell phones, no laptops. There's no communication allowed, or you'll be held in contempt by the judge if you're caught attempting to use any electronic device to communicate what's happening inside that courtroom before the hearing ends.
So the video camera is that sole shot we had in the hallway. That's the only one that's allowed in this process.
Inside the building, you're allowed on the 15th floor. The judge did allow for cameras to be in the hallway, the public hallway, but he will not allow a television camera into that courtroom at all. And still cameras just at the very beginning of what was going to be that hearing.
I can imagine people will see what they want to see, perhaps in this photo and body language, but it makes the statement more powerful than anything we've seen up to this point. That this is a president who's now reaching a new level of accountability and faces these charges, which apparently we believe his legal team is now knows, now that this hearing is underway, but the rest of us still waiting to see exactly what these counts are, what the strategy was of the DA, and what they plan to build this case on.
A different photo here of the former president now from one of the photographers who was in the room. Again, prior to these proceedings beginning, you talk about accountability, Lester, and for Democrats, and we've seen reaction from many of them today as well. We've talked a lot about the Republican Party because of Donald Trump's grip on that party, because of the dynamics politically as it relates to the people who want to run against him, who believe that it is Donald Trump's time to step aside and let a new generation of leadership come up in the GOP. But we've heard from Democrats who I think will say say that in their view, and another photo here, that this accountability is overdue in some ways. Of course, on the other side of the aisle, you have this continued drumbeat of the idea of political persecution. I mean, we're seeing that even from the head of the Republican National Committee coming out today and decrying what is unfolding as we speak inside this courtroom. Jonathan mentioned roughly 15 minutes long. It should be wrapping then by that timeline in the next 2 to 3 minutes here. They walked in right around 2:28. But here we see another image from inside of the former president of the United States seated in a courtroom in downtown Manhattan, facing now these charges, which we should hopefully know here what the specifics of them are in the next couple of minutes.
Kristen Welker, you're looking at these photos along with us. You've covered this president. Give us your thoughts.
Well, Lester, you can see the weight of this moment, I think, in Mr. Trump's face. And as I was saying earlier, one of his advisors said that from the view inside Trump world, these next few days are going to hurt. Well, you can see that playing out. I think that this is a heavy moment. It strikes me that we are standing here next to hundreds of protesters, Lester, but from the moment that the former president walked in to face this indictment, I have to tell you, it's been quite quiet outside of the courthouse. It's been somber. And I think that reflects really the mood of the country right now. This is a somber moment as we watch the first former U.S. president face an indictment, face criminal charges. Now, Hallie talked about Democrats who are weighing in. The one person who's not weighing in right now is President Biden. And Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was just asked about that. Why would he weigh in, for example, on January 6th and not this moment? She said, January 6th was just a different moment. It just was. It was something that was incredibly devastating. People died on that day. And then in talking about this moment, she said, we know that Americans still very much care about this when it comes to a criminal investigation like this that is ongoing. We are just not going to comment. But Lester, the question becomes, does President Biden need at some point to weigh in on this, if only to defend the legal proceedings here as they are being attacked by the former president and by his supporters? But again, I think you see in Mr. Trump's face, in those who are sitting around him, the weight and the gravity of this moment that has ripple effects across this entire country.
All right, Kristen, thanks. So we have Chuck Rosenberg up. I wanted to bring Chuck, if I can bring you into the conversation as we await the ending of this arraignment and the first bit of information about the indictment itself. You, as a prosecutor, you must go into a case. I can only imagine feeling 100% sure in your case. There's been a lot said about this indictment and what we don't know and what it might be and whether it's an untested legal theory. Is it hard for you to imagine a prosecutor under such scrutiny already to come in with a case that appears weak from the get-go?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've been 100% sure of anything in my life, Lester, but I can tell you this. The standard that you need to prevail in court as a prosecutor is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the highest standard in the law. The standard you need to obtain an indictment is probable cause, one of the lowest standards in the law. And so that gulf between those two things, between probable cause to indict and proof beyond a reasonable doubt to convict, that's where prosecutors make their money. And they don't make a lot, by the way. You have to have a degree of certainty. You have to have faith in the investigation. You have to trust in your witnesses. You have to have credible evidence that corroborates your witnesses. You have to believe you're going to win, or I don't believe it's appropriate to bring a case. You don't bring a case just because you're curious as to what the jury will do. You trust in it, you believe in it, and therefore I believe it's ethical to go forward. But 100% certainty, I'd be very surprised if any prosecutor told you they were 100% certain about each and every one of their cases. That said, prosecutors win an overwhelming percentage of their cases, but jurors are entitled to speak for the justice system in court. And sometimes they see it differently than we saw it. And that doesn't make us wrong and or right, frankly. The jurors have the final say, and as prosecutors, we respect that. The fact that they see something differently than we do, Lester, is okay. It's part of the system. I will say this. I just want to make one comment about the rule of law, if that's okay with you.
Sure, of course.
And Danny addressed it, and I just wanted to supplement it. I think he addressed it well and thoughtfully. The rule of law is a construct. Here's an NBC mug. If I were to drop this, it would hit the ground because the law of gravity applies everywhere and all the time. But the rule of law doesn't. And there are many, many, many countries around the world that don't enjoy the rule of law. But it's a construct. We built it, and if we're not careful with it because it's a precious commodity, we can lose it. So far, I believe the courts have done a magnificent job. We saw that in the run-up to the, in the run-up to the election, post-election, since January 6th. And again today, I think you're going to see the same thing. Courts around the country, state and federal, conducting themselves in a thoughtful, dignified, professional manner and upholding this really precious thing that we have, the rule of law.
What do you imagine there is to learn for the DA, the prosecutor in this case, from Mr. Trump's other legal experiences, his tendency to kind of try to delay the process? What might they take away from it?
Not much, and here's why I say that. Almost all of Mr. Trump's other legal experiences have been in the civil litigation realm. And there, unfortunately, a well-heeled defendant can wear down, or a well-heeled plaintiff, I should say, either way, can wear down the other side. Criminal cases are different things, right? They have their own life cycle. And you can't continuously delay, particularly if you have a good judge presiding, as we apparently have with Judge Merchan. So I'm not sure that the prosecutors ought to look at Mr. Trump's history in the civil litigation realm and draw much from it, one way or the other, because living in a criminal case is very different than living in a civil case.
All right, I want to go right to Kristen Welker outside the courtroom. We are getting word now of that indictment that has been unsealed. Kristen, what can you tell us?
Lester, I'm just going to read this note that we just got from Adam Reese, who is inside the courthouse. Let me read it to you. Former President Trump pleads not guilty to 34 counts of falsifying business records related to hush money payments in the 2016. Former President Donald Trump pleaded not guilty in a Manhattan courtroom, again, to 34 counts of falsifying business records and conspiracy for his alleged role in hush money payments to 2 women toward the end of his 2016 presidential campaign. The indictment, the first against a former president, was unsealed in a brief proceeding before Judge Merchan. So again, Lester, Mr. Trump pleading not guilty to 34 counts of falsifying business records. Obviously, Laura and Danny will have the ins and outs of what this means. But again, this is significant, this is historic, and it is unprecedented. And we now know that Mr. Trump has seen the charges against him and he has pleaded not guilty, Lester.
Danny, first thoughts.
Conspiracy, very significant. Conspiracy is a very effective tool used by prosecutors to charge someone, charge groups of people, and hold them accountable for all acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. But the big question now arises, who is the conspiracy with? Because a conspiracy involves 2 or more people who agree to engage in some kind of criminal act, some unlawful objective. If you were betting, the most likely co-conspirator might be Michael Cohen, who's not charged in this indictment, but he might be one of the alleged co-conspirators. We don't know yet, but it could also be a signal that maybe the DA didn't use federal election law as that predicate to boost this case from misdemeanor land up to a felony. Just as a quick recap, the falsification of business records statute in New York is a default misdemeanor. However, if the falsification is used in furtherance of or to commit another crime, it is bumped up to a felony. Not a super high level felony, but a nonviolent, I believe it's a Class D felony. Think 3 years statutory maximum sentence, but no mandatory minimum. So if that is the predicate felony, if it involves conspiracy or something that involves state law, then there's going to be no way to throw out that at the outset and claim that, hey, this is a federal election law and therefore New York cannot enforce it. Alvin Bragg may have decided, hey, we don't want to try and implicate federal law because that's going to be a motion from the defense. That's going to make things very difficult for us, and we could lose. The bottom line is there's no clear answer whether federal election law can support the aggravation of this New York crime to a felony. So it could be the case that Bragg's office cast about for a New York State crime, and maybe we'll see it in the form of that conspiracy. Whatever it is, we don't know what it is yet. And as Jonathan said, most of these indictments are not speaking indictments. They're going to be short and plain statements, the bare minimum to satisfy what an indictment has to say. It's the conservative thing to do. Prosecutors are generally conservative. They're not going to want to put a lot of information out there that they don't need to. But the conspiracy, to me, very significant, but we won't know exactly what ups the falsification of business records to a felony until we see that indictment. We need a little more information.
We need to see what was the purpose of the conspiracy, who was in the conspiracy, what were the so-called overt acts. You actually have to take a step in furtherance of that conspiracy. You don't actually have to complete the conspiracy. You don't actually have to go through with it. You can just intend to go through with it, and we need to see that.
This references money payments to 2 women.
Yeah, which we have to see the charging documents, but we know, of course, Stormy Daniels, the woman who alleges that she had this affair with Donald Trump back in 2006. So this goes back quite a while. And then obviously Karen McDougal is the other one that's been publicly reported. We'll have to see the charging documents, but those are the 2 women that we believe were at the center of this investigation. Obviously, Michael Cohen paid the money to Stormy Daniels, the $135,000. The money that goes to Karen McDougal is actually structured a little bit differently. That doesn't come from Michael Cohen. That actually comes from the National Enquirer, which engaged in this practice of so-called catch and kill, where they would take negative stories and bury them so that they couldn't see the light of day.
They own them, but they don't get out.
Exactly. And so they're actually the ones who paid the money to Karen McDougal. And then they enter into an agreement, actually, with federal prosecutors some time ago, where they agreed to sort of bear all, if you will, about what all happened. And as a part of that non-prosecution agreement, you see a reference to an agreement that gets made between Michael Cohen and an unnamed person as part of the campaign, which of course we believe to be Donald Trump. But I believe these papers will probably spell it out more explicitly than we've seen before.
I was going to say, so walk me through. I mean, does this mean that they have gotten past this idea of an untested legal theory and they're more in, I guess, more comfortable?
We need to see the charging papers. We need to see exactly how they describe how they are elevating it from what is normally a misdemeanor to a felony.
The key is, are they using a federal crime? Because I can promise you the most immediate motion will be from the defense that New York State cannot enforce federal law. But of course, the question is, are they enforcing it, or are they using it as a springboard, as is allowed under New York law, to elevate this crime from a misdemeanor to a felony? The actual law itself is vague. Yes, it says New York law, but then it has like a catch-all provision that says any rule, order, regulation. So the question arises, is federal election law a rule, order, regulation? And of course, the debate can go on back and forth. It may be the case that Alvin Bragg felt confident that, yes, we can, maybe we're not enforcing federal election law, but we can use it under New York law to make this misdemeanor, an otherwise misdemeanor, into a felony, and we'll take our chances with the defense's motion. Or it could be instead that they decided to make it as airtight as they could and find a New York state law, let's say a tax law, let's say New York State's equivalent of RICO. And RICO is just a statute, to boil it down, that criminalizes making an organization or a corporation a criminal. In other words, using an organization or a corporation to do the crimes and insulate the individual humans that are in that corporation. So that's what RICO does, and New York has a version of that. They could have used that. They may have even proceeded with an extortion theme. That was something tossed around by Mark Pomerantz in his book, that maybe if you look at Stormy Daniels as the extortioner, and I'm just being figurative here, hypothetically, if Stormy Daniels was extorting Donald Trump, and that would be a weird thing because Donald Trump would then be the victim, but if she was, then this is potentially money laundering, right? Because money laundering is concealing ill-gotten proceeds, and in this case, extortion could qualify. But again, that wouldn't be a slam dunk either. So Alvin Bragg had a lot of decisions to make when it came to this indictment, and we're going to learn so much when we see exactly, or when we learn exactly what laws, if indeed this is a falsification of business records that is boosted to a felony, we're going to learn a whole lot about their theory of the case when we learn what exactly is the crime that they used to make this a felony. Because here's what I think we can all agree on. This is not 30 plus misdemeanors. Procedurally, that doesn't even really work in New York. You can't convene a grand jury to return a true bill on a bunch of misdemeanor onlys. So really for us, the key is what is in that indictment. We still need to know exactly what the theory of the case is.
We know.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say Alvin Bragg was in the courtroom. We don't know if he spoke, but we know he was there.
Right, and we're still waiting to hear if the hearing is officially over. But one question for Danny or for Laura, isn't it possibly just simpler than that? Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to committing these crimes. And if Donald Trump is accused on the misdemeanor of falsifying records to help someone else commit a felony, the felony doesn't have to be committed by the individual himself, correct? It could be helping someone else do it. And Michael Cohen has already pleaded guilty to a felony. So isn't it possible that it's that simple?
But the felony that he pled guilty to is a federal campaign violation. And typically, that's something you would see federal prosecutors handle, not state prosecutors. And they passed. And there's a lot of debate about why they passed.
Yeah. Let me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but NBC News producer Adam Reese was just in the courthouse. He joins us on the telephone with details about the charges and about what he saw. Adam, take it away.
Lester, good afternoon. We all started at about 2:32 when the judge came in. Just prior to that, former President Trump entered the courtroom wearing a blue suit, a white shirt, and a red tie. He slowly walked past the reporters seated. He almost sort of ambled his way into the courtroom. He took his seat at the defense table in between his four attorneys. He was seated just in between his attorney, Susan Nichols, and Joe Tacopina. Todd Blanche, who was just added yesterday, was sitting at the end. He spoke on behalf of President Trump. Chris Conroy was the prosecutor, the assistant district attorney. He began by saying that there were 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. When he was asked, President Trump firmly said he pleads not guilty. The prosecutors handed over the indictment. They said it was unsealed at 1:30. In describing the indictment, they said that Mr. Trump tried to conceal a conspiracy and undermine the 2016 election, to identify and suppress negative information. This was covert and illegal payments at Mr. Trump's direction, directed to Michael Cohen, and the purpose was to suppress this affair and this negative information. He paid Cohen, and in doing so, he falsified those business records. He falsified it as cash. This was concealing another crime, a more serious crime. The prosecutor went on to say that Mr. Trump has made recent threatening emails and speeches, both directed at New York City, the courts here in New York, the justice system, and the district attorney's office. He said that these are irresponsible social media posts that threaten death and destruction and even World War III. He said that these public statements to the district attorney, which included a photo of him swinging a baseball bat towards the district attorney's head, was very concerning. They're concerned about this and what effect it will have on potential jurors and witnesses. But they said that this will not dissuade the office, and they're seeking a protective order regarding discovery materials. They're very concerned that some of the attorneys or some of this may be leaked, or that President Trump himself would use some of that discovery in a way that would compromise the potential trial. They began discussing conditions of release. They talked about how defense attorney Joe Tacopina had communications with Stormy Daniels, and that could present a conflict. In response, Todd Blanche, representing Mr. Trump, said that the people just spoke for 10 minutes. They haven't seen discovery. They talk about Michael Cohen, and Michael Cohen has been standing on the steps of this courthouse revealing all kinds of materials that will be relevant in the trial. Mr. Trump has, sorry, I'm just being moved here. They say that Mr. Trump has responded forcefully and clearly. He's very upset, he's frustrated, and he believes that this is an injustice. The hearing is going on right now. The judge said that he's taking the rhetoric and the language he's using, and he's very concerned about it. Blanche then said, well, this is free speech. He talked about the investigator, Mark Pomerantz, who wrote specifics. I'm going to have to toss it back to you, Lester.
All right, Adam, so just to be clear, I'm sorry, I lost you in my ear for a second. Just to be clear, these charges would be felonies then because he's citing the campaign violation, perhaps, finance violation.
I believe they're misdemeanors, 34 counts of falsifying in the first degree. I would defer to Laura.
Yeah, actually, let me.
If it's falsifying in the first degree, that's a felony.
Right. The first degree falsifying business records is a felony. So that means that we can divine that they are using some other predicate crime. Doesn't even really need to be a felony. No. So the big question is, what crime is it? So the theory of liability becomes he made false entries. But in addition, he violated some additional law, committed a crime, or concealed some other crime. And the question is, what is that crime? So that's the big question we still have.
All right, Adam, answer me this with regard to the DA's concerns about statements and actions and that sort of thing. Are they asking for some sort of relief or some admonishment from the court?
They are, Judge. They're asking the judge to make some kind of statement, some kind of warning. This judge is a low-profile judge, but he's very firm and he goes by the law. So we're going to have to wait and see what his decision is. But clearly, yes, the prosecutors want some kind of relief. They want some kind of, not necessarily a gag order, but something that will make sure that there is nothing that could influence any potential jurors or witnesses in an upcoming trial.
And the hearing is still going on, or is it over?
It's still going on.
So we don't know the resolution to that particular question. Can you give us any of the color of the room, what the former president's reaction was to all this?
As you know, Lester, the security around the courthouse has been very intense. We've all entered the courtrooms. There was one courtroom, the main courtroom, which he was in, and then there was an overflow courtroom. We had to go through two sets of magnetometers, one on the main floor and then one again up on the 15th floor. They've cleared out the whole building once he arrived, and then they slowly let photographers, cameramen, and journalists into the two courtrooms. He appeared, as we expected, that he's on good behavior. As I said, he walked into the courtroom, he sat between his attorneys, he remained quiet. He did confer with Susan Nichols and Mr. Tacopina a little bit. The prosecutors arrived in the courtroom at least 45 minutes prior to his arrival. Again, security very high. I did not see any Secret Service agents surrounding him. There was one agent at the door. We expected maybe they would come in and surround the defense table. We haven't seen that. In fact, most of the security has been handled by court officers. And really, we haven't seen many Secret Service officers within the building.
Okay, Adam, I'm with Laura Jarrett and Hallie Jackson and Danny Savalos. I think they may have questions for you, Laura.
Adam, thank you so much for all of your great work. Can you provide any information at all about how prosecutors described the actual conspiracy? Did they provide any details? Did they give a statutory cite? Did they say anything other than just promoting the election, and that the purpose of this conspiracy was certainly to bury information before the 2016 election?
That's exactly it. He did this all to undermine the election, to identify and suppress negative information, that these were covert and illegal payments at Mr. Trump's direction. The purpose was to suppress the affair. He paid Cohen with false business records, falsified his cash, and that this was aiding and concealing the concession of another crime. And again, as I said, they went on to say they were very concerned. He wasn't afraid to bring up the threatening email posts and statements that President Trump has been making. both against the city, the courts, the justice system, including the DA's office. They're very concerned, not only for their own safety, but for the influence of a potential witness or a juror. These social media posts that threaten death and destruction and World War III, the public statements he's been making, the picture of him swinging a baseball bat towards DA Bragg's head. They're very concerned about these posts and, again, the potential effect on jurors and witnesses. But he said this won't dissuade the office. They're seeking the protective order. We'll have to see what the judge decides on that, as well as conditions of release. They want him to be warned about his statements. And as I mentioned earlier, they're concerned that Tacopina, his attorney, Joe Tacopina, had communications with Stormy Daniels, and he will likely not be able to cross-examine her if, in fact, she becomes a witness. That's certainly a conflict of interest.
Adam, it's Hallie. I'm wondering if you can clarify or explain if the judge had any response to what you're talking about here, the idea that some of these threats have been brought up, not just against the prosecutor's office, but against the judge himself. And I also want to check on one point. I think I heard you say Todd Blanche spoke for Donald Trump, so Donald Trump himself did not say the words not guilty. Is that correct?
No, Donald Trump did say not guilty very firmly, but Todd Blanche was the attorney speaking on behalf of the defense. In terms of your question about the judge, he said we're taking this rhetoric and language that Mr. Trump is using very seriously.
Danny?
No questions for Adam right now. Well, actually, yes. I mean, was there any indication that the conspiracy was anything other than the hush money payments? For example, anything related to an extortionate scheme, an alleged extortionate scheme involving the hush money payments? Or was the indication that the payments were exclusively, the felony that we're talking about, the additional crime, is exclusively related to campaign finance law, as opposed to a state RICO statute or extortion or anything else?
No mention of that, no mention of RICO. But you do bring up a good point, which I want to bring up. There was no mention of the alleged affair with Karen McDougal. There was some speculation that the alleged affair with Karen McDougal may be wrapped into this case. And as far as what I heard before I left the courtroom, there's no indication that that's the case, that this is focused solely on the $130,000 that were paid to Stormy Daniels.
And we should note, we have not seen the former president leave that courtroom, so we have to assume, or based on what we know, that this hearing is still going on, which is considerably longer, I think, than anyone expected. I'm wondering, and I'll throw out to the panel here. Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Lester, I can tell you part of the reason that it's going on for a bit longer is because the first person to speak was a representative and attorney for the media. And they talked about that this case has monumental significance to the public, and we understand their competing interests, and there's interests of privacy on behalf of the defendant. But he's very concerned on working on a media plan going forward to avoid chaos. It's been a bit chaotic outside the courtroom. Outside the courthouse. You've got literally media from around the world, from Japan, from Finland and Sweden and Germany and England, and dozens from stations around the country. So he asked that we need to work together on a media plan going forward as we anticipate a trial, that the public is kept aware of what's going on. He asked, could we put people in the jury box so we can see some facial expressions of the defendant? Everybody in the courtroom is behind the defendant, so we can't see what his facial expressions are. And then anything that's involved with the court, any documents, anything as part of discovery, that's made public promptly. And again, laptops. We understand security concerns. This judge, typically, he just handled the Trump payroll court case. He allowed laptops. The judge said he would allow going forward. Just this arraignment is an unusual situation. The security is very high. So for today, no laptops, no electronics were allowed in the courtroom, but he seemed to indicate that going forward, not only will he allow reporters to sit in the jury box if he can make it happen, but that laptops will be allowed to be used.
Was there any discussion of change of venue? I know there were no formal motions that we know of, but was there any conversation or anything said about change of venues?
Not while I was in the room, and that would be very unlikely. But we did hear that maybe there had been some suggestion by the defense team to move it to Staten Island, for example, which is another borough of New York City, which is much more friendly to conservatives and to someone like Mr. Trump.
All right, Adam Reese again, who is in the courtroom, has now stepped out, and this hearing apparently continuing forward. As you noted, there was a media attorneys there speaking about future access and video equipment, and perhaps that might have slowed down the process, but they are still in there in an arraignment where typically the guilty or not guilty, and in this case, the former president entering obviously a not guilty plea as his lawyers had anticipated. We will continue to watch that camera in the hallway. The former president did not speak as he was going in, simply gave a glance toward a questioner in the hallway there. We don't know on the way out if he will speak, but I think we're all struck by the DA's office bringing up this issue about the former president's behavior and statements and social media posts, the troubling nature of those, and the judge obviously aware of them. What have you both learned so far that in terms of the strategy of the state going forward?
Well, so far as it relates to the political sphere of things, it seems like, frankly, not much yet has changed. Now that news of this indictment and what the charges actually are has come out, we are already seeing some of the first fundraising post-arraignment, or I guess during arraignment, come out, and that is from Trump ally Senator Lindsey Graham, who has blasted out now his fundraising email. We've also heard from Trump opponents who have said that they have put up a billboard that will greet Donald Trump when he lands back down in Mar-a-Lago in West Palm Beach and then makes his way to Palm Beach, that says nobody essentially is above the law. So here we are again seeing sort of these political positions here. As Donald Trump, I'm also struck, it's like 45 minutes now that he's been in that room. He sat and listened to those media attorneys make their case. He said those two words, and I think that's important, and an important piece of color from Adam Reese here, that it was Donald Trump himself who stood up and declared in a court of law not guilty related to these felony charges against him now.
All right, let me go to Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, that was an amazing report there by Adam, kind of listing out what he saw and witnessed in the time inside the courtroom. Piecing it all together, where does that leave us right now? As Hallie noted, we may not have moved much farther than we were earlier this afternoon.
No. Well, in one way we have, Lester, because the arraignment initiates the criminal process with an actual defendant in the well of the court before a judge, subject to the judge's orders on timing and scheduling motions and the like. That said, I agree with Laura and Danny. We need to see the indictment to understand exactly how this case was charged. I will note one thing. If early reporting is accurate, that it includes a conspiracy charge, that gives a couple of advantages normally to the prosecutor. Conspiracies can run from a very early date to a very late date. It could encompass a lot of activity, and there is a particular evidentiary value because statements by co-conspirators that are made in furtherance of the conspiracy are admissible at the trial of this particular defendant, Mr. Trump. And so it's a way, legally and ethically, for prosecutors to adduce a lot of evidence. If it really involves other women or other payments, even as part of the conspiracy, it also enables prosecutors to show a pattern of conduct. And the more conduct you can show, the easier it becomes for prosecutors to prove intent, something that's necessary to sustain a charge in front of a jury. So I heard Adam, in his good reporting, talk about a conspiracy. I very much would like to see that, how far back it runs, what the facts are as alleged, and who it involves.
And we will see that, I believe, once it's unsealed. Some of those questions will be answered rather immediately.
That's absolutely right. The indictment will soon be publicly available. We can all pore over it, we can read through it, and we can better understand what the theory of the case is. But based on initial reporting, it sounds like almost 36 felony counts. I'm not surprised that they are felonies and not misdemeanors. Danny spoke to that earlier. I'm not sure you would need a grand jury just to bring misdemeanor charges in a New York State court. But you're right, Lester. We will soon have the indictment, and we can stop guessing and start understanding.
All right, Chuck, let me turn to Catherine Christian again. You wanted to weigh in on that protective order that came up during this hearing, or this arraignment.
Yes, well, Mr. Trump hurt himself by his own words, because typically in gang cases, you see the gang members who are being prosecuted, either they or their family members start putting things up on social media, intimidating witnesses on social media, actually using documents they received in discovery and putting it up on social media. So I wasn't in the courtroom, and the reporter was reporting that the prosecutors were asking for that because of his social media posts, because of his emails. So they're asking for a protective order, meaning the discovery that they are entitled to within 35 days of the Supreme Court arraignment. They're going to ask Judge Michon to limit some of those documents from going to the team because they're afraid that Mr. Trump will basically act like what we see in gang cases and start putting things up and stating things on social media, which would be very intimidating to the witnesses in this case.
So if the judge goes along, he'll be issuing orders today on that issue?
Not necessarily today. He could do it today, or it's typically you put that in writing. When they have to disclose a voluminous amount of material, and then you seek a protective order. You say, Your Honor, we're disclosing all of this material, but we want to hold back this hunk of material, and these are the reasons why. So they have to articulate the reasons why. And also they could submit material, but they're redacting some things. So you'll get a piece of paper, and it looks like an FBI file, quite frankly. You start redacting information out of there because you're saying that we don't trust the defendant. Not saying we're not to trust the defense attorneys. We're saying we don't trust the defendant to have this material yet.
All right, let me bring back, Catherine, thanks. Let me bring back Jonathan Deans, Chief Investigative Reporter for WNBC and part of our justice team here on the network side. You've been watching this play out. It's the speed of things is a little slower than we thought, but are you surprised that this protective issue, this language and behavior issue is becoming such a big part of this today?
I'm somewhat surprised. I think regarding the evidence and the discovery, I think it's often in cases like this and in other cases, judges put protective orders to prevent the defense or the prosecution from putting out that evidence as to ensure the fairness of the process and of the trial. So perhaps some sort of protective order on that evidence doesn't surprise me. What did surprise me was that Adam Reese and other reporters have been able to leave the overflow room and to make calls during the hearing in the public courtroom. So I guess they were able in the overflow room to come and go as they please, and the doors were not restricted as it is in the courtroom, which is why we haven't heard from Garrett or Melissa, who are in the courtroom itself, because they're in there. But the overflow rooms, it sounds like there was lesser controls, and so some reporters have been able to come out and make calls and provide updates while the hearing is going on, and that's what Adam was able to do with quite thoroughness. And again, just to be clear, 34 counts, falsifying business records in the first degree. My understanding, it can be up to 4 years in prison, but it could be as little as 0 if convicted. And remember that the Trump defense team is going to fight this tooth and nail and look to have these charges thrown out and fight it each step of the way. And Trump himself, according to Adam Reese, was the one who said not guilty in that courtroom.
One of the things that strikes me about the protective order is if the investigation is ongoing. And that's one of the things I wonder if somebody will ask Bragg today at the press conference, is this it? Is this the final end of the road here? Or is it the investigation still ongoing? Because he had said at a time that the larger investigation into sort of the financial fraud issues going on at the Trump organization was ongoing, even though those prosecutors walked off the case. He said that that investigation continued. Query whether it actually is, query whether they're doing anything on it. But one of the reasons you might want a protective order is if, in fact, you're still digging and you're still trying to get witnesses to cooperate. You're still trying to get sort of the pieces of the puzzle to come together. You want to protect the integrity of the investigation while it's ongoing.
As a layperson, can you help me understand the difference between a protective order and something that is more serious? In other words, how does that restrict?
Protective order is quite serious if you violate it.
It's not the same thing as a gag order?
The gag order is different. The gag order would be used to really protect the defendant's right to a free and protect the right to a trial and a fair trial. The protective order is to protect the integrity of the actual investigation and the documents and materials that they don't want to show up on NBC's website.
Well, would it prevent Donald Trump from talking about any documents and materials he's seen?
Well, we need to see the terms of it. And again, that's why I think Catherine is pointing out, typically you would make this request in writing and you would lay out exactly what you want the parameters to be.
You know, there's a lot of strategy here, too. I mean, this is the prosecutor's first chance to talk to the judge and kind of set the stage. And now, I'm a jaded defense attorney, so take that with a grain of salt. You know, I may be clouded here. But the point is, this is the prosecutor's first chance to exert some control over the defendant. So why not put everything you can in front of this judge about all this defendant's bad behavior and set a baseline, right? Hey, judge, here's all the things this defendant is doing. Put him on a short leash now, and that will benefit the prosecutors. Here's why. If he violates, you can bring him back, and he'll at minimum get in trouble. At worst, he might even be remanded. He might even be put in custody for violating a protective order. This is chess, and the prosecution is playing aggressively early by asking for a protective order. It might get denied, but they've at least planted it in the court's mind that this is somebody who may be misbehaving, and you need to watch him.
They're saying we're watching.
Consider the advantage. If he violates and he comes back and he gets remanded as punishment for violating a protective order, if he's actually incarcerated, which I don't even know how that would look. I don't know how you would do that. Maybe you put him on house arrest. Far more likely, put an ankle monitor on him and control and monitor him at all times. But every single encumbrance that the court or the prosecution can get put on a defendant inures to their benefit. The extreme example is that the statistics show that if you have a client who's incarcerated pending trial, the odds of getting convicted are just so much more because you don't have access to them. This is the part of the game, you know, and I'm not saying game in a glib way. I mean, both sides play. But the prosecution here is trying to get everything they can at every instance, and you can't fault them for that. They're here to win. They brought their game face, and they are coming out strong from the outset.
Here's another wider photo now from the courthouse that's been provided, one of the still photos. Let me bring in Chuck Todd. Chuck, if you can talk about the political implications. Does this change anything? Does this enlighten us, reveal anything that may change the conversation?
Well, right now, no. But let me just quickly on this gag order idea or some sort of protective order for this. Look, one of the things they're going to, this was one of the motivations of why Donald Trump announced so ridiculously early, is he was gaming out a lot of these scenarios here of being able to try to, number one, he knows that the Justice Department doesn't like to look like it's interfering in a campaign. It's harder to put a gag order on somebody who's running for office. There are First Amendment rights that come with that. So I think I had talked with Cy Vance about this off camera to me, and he said, getting the gag order might be easy, figuring out how to enforce it, and figuring out whether it's worth trying to enforce it.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. We're seeing Donald Trump leaving the courthouse and not making any comments. There was a microphone there, and a reporter had asked earlier if he would say anything. Obviously not. This hearing, though, going on, as we noted, a little considerably longer than we thought. Jonathan Dienst with us. So what happens now? The arraignment is over.
One thing we would talk, at least up until a couple minutes ago, there was no gag order issued by the judge. I don't know what happened in the last couple minutes there, but as of now, and we'll wait to hear from Adam Reese or Garrett or Melissa Russo, who are in the courtroom, and they'll be coming out. They will not be allowed to come out until, I understand, until Donald Trump has exited the building. So he will now go down the elevator from that 15th floor. As you see, the caravan is now set up, awaiting the former president, who is now an accused criminal, 34 counts, accused of falsifying business records in the first degree. He will be brought down the elevator, exit 1 Hogan Place, which is that street that is shut down on the side of the courthouse there. He'll be put into one of the SUVs, and he'll be taken to LaGuardia Airport, where his plane is waiting for him, and he will be flown back to Florida and Mar-a-Lago, where he expects to make a statement tonight around 8:15 p.m. Meanwhile, the Manhattan District Attorney, who had scheduled a news conference for 3:30, 4 minutes from now, obviously that is going to be delayed given the length that this court hearing went. So we would probably expect that to begin 4:30, if you will. That is in the building across the street. And he will come out and explain the charges. Now that the hearing is over, we would expect the Manhattan DA's office to email the indictment to all reporters. And I believe that was President Trump walking out, Hallie.
Yeah, that is former President Donald Trump now leaving the courtroom, walking into that motorcade. He will now be on his way back to Mar-a-Lago for this speech here. I want to bring in Kristen Welker, who's outside the courthouse. Kristen?
Well, Hallie, we saw some activity here with his motorcade just a few moments ago and thought that that might be a signal that he was about to leave. And so, as you say, he's now entered his motorcade. They are about to take off momentarily. Hallie, you can see the throngs of police here, the security here. The mayor of New York had said going into today that they were prepared for this moment. President Biden had said he had full faith in the police here to protect this space. And while there are hundreds of protesters, those who support former President Trump, those who are critical of him, gathered in a park nearby, Hallie, I have to tell you, they have been peaceful throughout this entire process. Now you see his motorcade, Hallie, taking off, departing as we speak from Hogan Place, from officially being charged here, pleading not guilty to those 34 counts that we just talked about. And so he is going to head to LaGuardia Airport, where he will head to Mar-a-Lago, as you say, and make those remarks tonight. And again, just to remind folks, Hallie, we expect to hear from a defiant former President Trump, right? He was sort of slumped over in the courtroom based on that photo that we saw of the former president. But I expect we will see a very different Mr. Trump tonight when he speaks to supporters at Mar-a-Lago, Hallie.
He has been traveling, Kristen, with a series of aides from his campaign, obviously with members of his legal team, many of whom are expected to accompany him back to Mar-a-Lago, where, frankly, the crowd will be, I think, friendlier than what he has seen so far in Manhattan. He's expected to be in front of supporters. It is entirely possible that we will see supporters there in West Palm and in Palm Beach, lining the route that Donald Trump will come back home. I think there is another key piece of information as we talk about the politics of it that we're waiting on, which is the indictment itself and getting some of the specifics that we've been discussing here as far as the legal implications. I want to note something that Jonathan Dean's talked about, which is, again, the extraordinary security measures that have been in place, not just today for the last 6-8 hours plus in an intensive way, but frankly, Jonathan, as you've been reporting and as you were first to report a week and a half ago, that have been in place for days now.
Yeah, for about 2 weeks now, you know, from the FBI to the court officers to the NYPD, they've all been working and preparing for this day, and this day has come. And as you can see in one of the shots before, as the president was leaving, the former president leaving the courthouse, the lines of people rose deep to get a look at this day in history. I thought that was an extraordinary sight here in Manhattan. We understood that there were going to be a few hundred protesters, pro and con, in that Foley Square area in and around the courthouse. But the fact that for several blocks leaving that 100 Center Street area, that those sidewalks were pretty jammed with people. Now you see he's approaching the entrance to the FDR Drive, which will take him north towards the Triborough Bridge. And LaGuardia Airport, where his plane is waiting for him. But the former president of the United States stand accused of 34 counts of falsifying business records and conspiracy, and leaves an accused criminal. He pleaded not guilty, and just an extraordinary day. And we wait to hear more from the reporters who are in the courtroom and in the overflow rooms about exactly what went on inside during that 45-minute hearing.
Danny, what do you think his lawyers are telling him right now? Now that they see what the prosecution has put together, they're saying, don't worry, you're fine, there's no case here? Or is this the moment where you have to acknowledge that this could be a big deal?
I think what you'll find is that Donald Trump isn't as intensely involved in looking at the indictment as his lawyers are. I picture his team huddling around this indictment, parsing it out, although at this point, there can't be much that surprises them. Frankly, there can't be much that surprises all of us. When this indictment comes out, I really doubt we're going to see some crime in there that we never imagined, never heard a fact about. Consider that most of this stuff has been publicly known since what, 5, 6, 7 years? We've had the documents, we've had the checks, we've had the contracts. So I don't think there are a lot of surprises. Most likely, it's his legal team. They're huddling together. What do we do next? What motions are we filing? Again, they probably already figured that out. And Trump may have taken a glance at it, taken a look at it. It's kind of written in legalese, indictments are. You're going to have the dates of the conspiracy. You're going to have the different counts. But if you haven't looked at a lot of indictments, there isn't usually a lot of information in there that's helpful to a layperson who's trying to learn about their case, especially if it is, as I suspect it is, a bare bones indictment, not a what's called a speaking indictment, where in the modern era of Adobe and Microsoft Word, people insert photographs and charts and all kinds of different things. And you do see that in the federal context. For example, they might put a chart in of all the money laundering or structuring counts or things like that. And you might see that here. You might see a chart of all the different checks, the payments, when made. You might see that in this indictment. It's possible. But it's not the kind of thing that I think Trump would even interest himself much with. He knows the basics. He knows what he's charged with. He's the kind of guy that's going to say, lawyers, you handle it until I decide that you're not handling it the way I like you to handle it, and then I'll get new lawyers in.
And we noted he expanded his legal team only as recently as yesterday. We continue to watch the former president make his way to LaGuardia Airport. Let me go to Kristen Welker, who's outside the courthouse now that that convoy has cleared that area. What are you seeing?
Well, Lester, the convoy has cleared the area, but former President Trump's supporters are still here. In fact, there is a Trump sign unfurled, some of his protesters holding that. But again, this crowd is largely calm. They are somber, and I think it underscores the mixed emotions today. The fact that, yes, the former president is using this moment to strike a defiant stance, but again, this is an historic moment, the first former president to face an indictment, and his supporters, based on what I'm seeing here outside of the courthouse, really seem to understand the gravity of that, the significance of that. You talked about the fact that there is so much unknown. Legally, the path forward is unknown, and politically, it is unknown as well. We keep talking about this, the fact that in the short term, this may bolster Mr. Trump in the primaries, but it's not clear how it looks as the primaries drag on once debate starts, and if he is to make it to a general election, how that will play with independent voters, with women voters, for voters who voted for him in 2016 but switched to Biden in 2020. It's a real question mark, Lester, moving forward.
All right, Kristen Welker, thank you. We want you to stay tuned. We do expect to hear from Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, a previously scheduled news conference scheduled to start right about now. We'll, of course, take you there when he takes the podium. I want to go to NBC News legal analyst Kristen Gibbons-Fedden. Let's talk about what we can expect in the discovery in this case, the research, the grist of the case.
Yeah, so we can expect discovery is really just the exchange of information. Any information that is favorable or unfavorable to the defendant within the prosecution of the case. The defendant would be entitled to that. So that's the prosecutor turning over anything from statements, probably from Stormy Daniels, maybe even Ms. McDougal. But there will also be potentially motions to uncover any of the testimony or evidence that was given to the grand jury. Keep in mind, the grand jury proceedings are secret, but there are certain rules governing the disclosure of that information. So depending on if the prosecution asserts that some of the evidence should remain under seal, that will also be a challenge by Trump's team, because reasonably they're going to want every single thing, testimony and arguments that were made before the grand jury that was relied upon them to indict.
All right, again, watching this motorcade make its way up the FDR on its way to LaGuardia Airport, where the former president will return to his home in Palm Beach and deliver a speech that he has widely promoted tonight to the American people. That'll be covered, by the way, on NBC News Now, our streaming channel.
And Lester, you know, we're just getting the indictment in here as well. I'm reading through it as we speak, and I'm looking at 34 counts. As Adam reported in court there, I'm seeing falsifying business records in the first degree, which we know is a felony, and looking to see here how they outline, obviously, what the second crime is here. You can see it on the screen there as we're scrolling through it
It's
here.
automatically a felony, or only if they...
If they escalate it, if they find a way to step it up. But that's what I'm searching for now, to see how they describe it. It's pretty bare bones, a lot of boilerplate language repeated for each and every count there. As I said, 34 counts falsifying business records in the first degree.
16 pages long, this indictment is. Just to give you a sense, it is literally out in the last 45 seconds. So Laura is admirably reading it on the air. Yeah, live as we are getting it here. And it does not, I will defer to the legal experts on this, it does not appear to be that so-called speaking indictment or anything that is more further fleshed out, which means that in the next couple of minutes, when we do hear from Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, that would be his opportunity to elaborate on some of what our own Adam Reese reported went down in court. Some of the description of what prosecutors think, the idea that they believe he tried to suppress information ahead of the 2016 campaign.
Yeah. This, Lester, is the moment legal analysts dread, because it's when a document like this comes out. It's only 16 pages, but we're frantically going through it. We've only just gotten it, and we're getting a look at the first charges. And indeed, it is falsifying business records in the first degree of felony, and we should find out relatively soon what that predicate crime is that was used to elevate what is ordinarily a misdemeanor into felony land.
I'm going to let you guys go through that, and let me go right now to NBC News national correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, who was inside the courtroom, has just come out. Gabe, what can you tell us about the proceeding?
Well, Lester, this indictment is not a speaking indictment. I can tell you that what happened inside that courtroom definitely had a lot of speaking in it. It is unlike any arraignment that I have ever seen. It went on for at least 45 minutes, and it basically devolved into opening arguments in this trial. Just within the past few moments, we learned that the prosecution had wanted a trial date for January of 2024, just next year. Incredibly, that would place it right smack in the middle of a presidential election. Since then, the defense came back and said they wanted a little bit more time and wanted to push it back to the spring. The new information we have is that over the next few months, there will be discovery, and basically the next time of scheduled court appearance for the former president is December 8th, many months from now. Still, Lester, I can go through this quite a bit. It basically started with the prosecution laying out its case right here. And as my colleague Adam Reese reported, this is 34 felony counts of falsifying business records with the intent to, conspiracy to undermine the 2016 election. I'll let you guys go through the indictment. I have not seen it myself, but I can tell you that the prosecution laid into the defense, saying that over the past several weeks there had been irresponsible social media posts, that the defendant had said that there would be death and destruction because of this indictment, and that the defendant has also directed threats at the DA's office. And these threats led to increased law enforcement efforts. I was able to get a clear view of former President Trump. We had the monitor facing him. He was sitting in between his defense attorneys, and he was looking mostly silent most of the proceeding, only able to say, and actually this is Mr. Trump's defense team. If we can look over here, Tony. This is President Trump's defense team right here, Joe Tacopina. I'll continue my description, Lester, but let's see if we can take, you may want to take this response live. This is Todd Blanche and Joe Tacopina. I'm not sure if we have a camera there. I'll try to listen in
we can see
and
it.
pass along what they're saying. I'm trying. Hold on one moment.
Get that cell phone back. Hey, cell phone.
This Olympia.
Okay, we're trying to listen in. Joe Tecatino, attorney for former President Trump, is speaking to a gaggle of reporters. We're trying to get our microphone on
And it's
there.
not a good day. It's not a sad day. I don't expect this to happen in this country. You don't expect this to happen to somebody who was the president of the United States. And on the one hand, there's not really any surprises. I know there was a lot of talk over the past several weeks and the past several days about what's going to be in this indictment and what's going to be there that we don't know. There must be something besides what we've been talking about for the past 4 or 5 years. There wasn't. There's nothing. The indictment itself is boilerplate. It doesn't allege any federal crime, any state crime that's been violated. It doesn't allege what the false statement is. And it's really disappointing. It's sad, and we're going to fight it. We're going to fight it hard.
Were you surprised by anything in the indictment?
No.
How about you, Joe? Were you surprised?
Yeah, I was surprised there were no facts in there. I mean, normally in an indictment you have alleged facts. So they said that this was a false business record entry to aid and abet another crime without saying what the other crime was.
Can you talk about his demeanor? How was he doing?
Trump's reaction was when he saw the charges against him.
When you say what his reaction was, what do you expect his reaction was? I mean, his reaction was exactly what would happen if it happened to anybody that I'm looking at now or anybody that's hearing what you're saying. He's frustrated, he's upset, but I'll tell you what, he's motivated, and it's not going to stop him, and it's not going to slow him down, and it's exactly what he expected, and so to that extent, there's no surprise. But he's also upset and frustrated and disappointed and mad that this happened.
What about the warnings against his rhetoric on Twitter? What was the former president's
What? There was not a warning. What do you mean?
From the judge, talking about
The judge did not warn.
the
The district attorney made a statement addressing what they perceived to be, I'm not sure what the words they use, inappropriate rhetoric of some sort. Obviously, we responded, and the judge just took it in. The judge didn't warn. He asked the parties to consider what they're saying and not saying.
Guys, he did not admonish the president.
There was no admonishment.
That the president not use language that would incite violence or civil unrest.
He did not request that the president not use language. He requested that everybody involved refrain from using language that's inappropriate. And by the way, that includes the witnesses for the people who are talking just as much as the president.
The former president swinging a baseball bat at the head of the Manhattan DA.
Well, I don't know where you got that, because if
That
you
was a tweet sent out by the former president.
no, it wasn't. And first of all, that picture was not swinging a baseball bat. I mean, if you want to distort the facts, go right ahead. I won't address that. Yes, it is. He wasn't swinging a baseball bat at anyone's head. That was a picture of him showing off an American-made bat. Someone else put a picture of the district attorney next to him, and in an article posted that. That's not his article. That's not his photos.
It's not using language that incites.
Guys, here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the insufficiency of this case. And I will say this to you. Today's unsealing of this indictment shows that the rule of law died in this country. Because while everyone is not above the law, no one's below it either. And if this man's name was not Donald J. Trump, there is no scenario we'd all be here today. Please understand that based on these charges.
What are we going to hear tonight when he speaks?
When? Yeah, 8 o'clock.
What are we going to hear?
What? I don't know. You'll hear it.
You should tune in and you'll hear it.
You think we know?
The prosecution wanted a trial in January. Didn't you think that was realistic?
No.
Can you guys talk about, there's a lot of speculation about the unity among the defense attorneys.
Look at this. Look at us.
Is that why you chose to do this?
To come out together? We chose
ridiculous.
to come out together so we could speak with one voice. But there is no disunity here. That's gossip and it's nonsense. We've been working together and we will be working together.
And this, to me, quite frankly, is the best team I've ever worked with, the lawyers. I'm honored to be working with these guys. It's a family, it's a team, and we have one mission, and we'll achieve that mission.
What's your next move?
I mean, I'm going to go home and have some food.
What about the change of venue stuff? When do we?
I mean, we're going to start fighting the case. I didn't mean to be flippant with you.
When do you start filing motions? I'm assuming one of the first things you're going to do.
The judge set a motion schedule
to dismiss. I assume that'll be
the judge set a motion schedule that requires motion files in 4 months. So that's when we'll be filing motions.
This whole notion about how this is sort of like a novel, or do you?
It's not a notion. It's actually a fact. It's never been charged
talk
before.
about that. But like,
there's nothing else to say except the district attorney. This office has existed for decades and decades, and you can find one if you'd like. You'll never see a charge like this ever.
You understand
this case.
You understand this. It's as simple as this. A state prosecutor is prosecuting a federal election law violation that doesn't exist according to federal election law officials. It's as simple as that. You can sum it all up like that.
Will there be anything else in your motion to dismiss?
We haven't even come
What about
close
the change
to
of
the
venue? There's all this talk. Can someone address that now?
The defendant could potentially post discovery on social media.
Impromptu news conference outside the courthouse with the attorneys for former President Donald Trump, who right now is nearing LaGuardia Airport for his return to Florida after what was described as about a 45-minute long arraignment hearing in which a number of issues were discussed, including some of the tone of language that had concerned the DA's office from the former president. But his attorneys strongly defending the former president and challenging the DA to come up with facts which they think are not in evidence right now. Laura Jarrett has been working this set of documents we've received here, the actual indictment, and help us understand what it says and what it doesn't say.
Okay, so what we have here is an indictment that's laying forth the exact counts. Those are statutory cites that relate to the criminal code in New York. That's what we have, the 34 counts falsifying business records. In addition, we have a lengthy statement of facts, some 44 paragraphs in length. So we talk about a speaking indictment. This is singing it from the rooftops, telling the story of what happened. And we're still going through it. But part of what's interesting is it's laying out a narrative in the language of conspiracy, but they haven't actually charged conspiracy as a separate count, which is interesting. And I wondered how they were going to do it, because we all knew that they were going to need some hook to escalate this to a felony. And their hook is laid out in this narrative description, but it's not actually charged as a separate crime, which will be interesting. And I'm sure the former president's lawyers will attack that and figure out a way to say that that's not a proper way to do things. But it is interesting to know how explicit they are about the former president's role in what they are saying is essentially a scheme to defraud the American public.
That he was an active participant?
That he was an active participant, that he had meetings about this, and that he did this for the sole purpose was to make sure that negative information did not come out before the 2016 election. That is certainly what Michael Cohen pled guilty to. It's certainly what the publisher of the National Enquirer pled guilty to as part of his non-prosecution agreement. So we have heard this story told before by federal prosecutors in those agreements. We have never heard this story told before quite as explicitly as we are hearing it today from the mouths of the state district attorney in Manhattan.
There are no names listed here in this statement of facts, because you're right, Laura, this is separate technically from the indictment itself, but it clearly lays out all of what we've been talking about, the sort of color narrative, if you will, of what happened.
Yeah.
But based on some of the identifying pieces of information that are in here, like the amounts of the hush money payments, it seems at this point that this is about Karen McDougal, who we talked about, and Stormy Daniels. Stormy Daniels, of course, an adult film star who just today is out with a new, essentially, magazine feature talking about how she hopes to feel at some point vindicated, as well as Karen McDougal, this former Playboy model, who also says that she received a hush money payment that came through, as Laura explained earlier in our special coverage here, that came through a publication, kind of a catch and kill scheme, which, again, here in the statement of facts, the prosecutor's office is laying out.
Yeah, and laying it out, I just want to read a little bit of it because the language is just so striking here, talking about from August of 2015 to December of 2017, the defendant, the former president, orchestrated a scheme with others to influence the 2016 presidential election by identifying and purchasing negative information about him to suppress its publication and benefit the defendant's electoral prospects. It goes on to say, in order to execute the unlawful scheme, the participants violated election laws. Now, they don't say they're federal laws, state laws, and caused false entries in the business records of various entities in New York. The participants also took steps that mischaracterized for tax purposes. They're not charging tax crimes, but they're saying took steps that mischaracterized for tax purposes the true nature of the payments made in furtherance of the scheme. And so they've used this statement of facts, again, to sort of tell the story but they're not charging those things as separate crimes.
Are they telegraphing, though, that may come into play at some point?
Well, that's one of the things I hope somebody asked the district attorney today at that press conference.
Yeah, the statute doesn't appear to require someone to plead and actually prove the crime that is used to launch this case into felony land. So at this point, they don't necessarily need to charge it. What they appear to be doing here is just alleging it, whether it be an election law violation, whether it be a tax crime of some kind. It seems pretty straightforward that we're just talking about falsification of business records that is made into a felony. And I don't think that's an accident that the DA's office is being a little vague here, because they don't necessarily want to commit to anything. You don't want to do that in an indictment, commit to something that you can't prove or aren't planning to prove. But make no mistake about it, and I'm putting my defense hat on for the moment, you're going to see motions, number one, that New York has no jurisdiction to enforce anything related to election law, unless it is somehow New York state election law. You're also going to see a motion that because the payments were made by Michael Cohen, and allegedly made by Michael Cohen, to benefit Trump personally and his family, that takes it out of the purview of election law. In other words, because it wasn't to benefit the campaign, it was to benefit his family, therefore, this is not a viable charge. Now, other defenses that won't be the subject of a motion to dismiss, but we'll see them at trial, will be the advice of counsel defense. Hey, I just did what my lawyer told me to. Now, anyone who knows Donald Trump knows that that's probably not likely. Donald Trump doesn't take the instructions of his lawyers any more than he takes them from anyone else. Heads of state, anybody. And if he doesn't like what his lawyer's saying, he fires him and he gets a new lawyer. We know that. But you can bet that you will see an advice of counsel defense at trial, and that that'll be one of many that they will try to assert if this case ever gets to trial. But believe me, they're going to have, and you saw it at the press conference, the defense team is going to be filing motions, and I suspect a lot of them. They are going to try and chip away at this case. Best case scenario for them, if they can throw out the felony and leave Alvin Bragg only charging the president with misdemeanors. Now, this is a little beyond my pay grade because it's political. This would be a huge win for Donald Trump if the first prosecution by Alvin Bragg proceeds only as misdemeanors in New York City. That would not be a win, even if you convicted him on those misdemeanors. It would be a symbolic loss.
Characterize it for me. Is this any weightier, any more serious for the former president right now than it was, a couple of hours ago?
So far, I have seen 0.0 surprises. There's nothing new in either the statement of facts or the indictment. I am surprised slightly that this is exclusively about hush money payments. I did expect to see more, but I also expected, and you see this on page 1 of the indictment, what you see is that they took one event, say February 14, 2017, and you see the first 4 counts of the indictment are all related to February 14, 2017. So they're taking really one transaction and extracting 4 different crimes from that transaction. That, as I'm sitting here thinking of it, might raise yet another motion, which is that they are trying to make multiple crimes out of a single transaction. These are concepts like multiplicity in criminal law, that if the government tries to heap on too many crimes that are really just one transaction, then you might be able to get the indictment dismissed. Long shot. These are all long shots. Judges hate to take cases away from prosecutors. They like to give them their day in court. But by filing those motions, what they do is they preserve it for appeal, so that if things go badly at trial, these are all preserved issues for appeal. They're issues of law that an appellate court, with quiet reflection, may take in a different direction. So that's the strategy as I see it. I have no doubt we'll see those motions in the coming months, weeks and months, however much time they have to file.
All right, let me bring in Chuck Rosenberg. Chuck, your reading of this case?
Yeah, and Lester, if Catherine is still here, I would love to ask her a question. But if not, I can certainly give you. Well, Catherine, if you don't mind, in my federal practice, we would typically propose a speaking indictment. There's a separate document here, a statement of facts, and it has an indictment number on it, which I assume correlates to the 34-count indictment. How does the district attorney's office use that statement of facts, and what is its legal weight in the proceedings?
I tell you, Chuck, I'm at a loss. When I looked at this indictment and saw that every single count because I heard a reporter earlier talking about conspiracy, and I'm like, oh, there's a conspiracy count. There is no conspiracy count.
Yeah.
So there are 34 counts of the same charge, falsifying business records. And the statement of facts talks about the Playboy model, Karen McDougal, and Stormy Daniels. So it appears that this indictment is solely about the hush money payment to Miss Daniels, the catch and kill regarding Miss McDougal. The statement of facts, quite frankly, I haven't seen this. It's usually, if you're charging conspiracy, you list out all the overt acts. That's sort of how you get all the information in there. Well, there is no conspiracy count. So I agree with Danny. There's going to be very substantive motions. And then, Danny, you said that if they can reduce these felonies to a misdemeanor, remember, even on the misdemeanor charge, you still have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Trump put this false entry in his business records with the intent to defraud. So even that is not so clear. That's the argument they're going to make. So I was actually saying, oh, now there's going to be conspiracy and they're probably going to talk about tax crimes. So I'm not going to say it's shocking, but I'm surprised that the 34 counts are all falsifying business records and they all involve Ms. Daniels.
Speaking for the lay people in the room, are you saying this is a weak case?
I've always said it was a tough case because you have to prove intent to defraud. And for the felony, you have to prove, in addition to intent to defraud, the intent to commit another crime. And if that other crime was the campaign finance law, well, it's a novel theory, which makes it a tough case. It's also a tough case because the main witness is Michael Cohen. Now, I use cooperators all the time. You cannot do an organized crime case without a cooperator. And what you do is you corroborate every word, every accusation that he makes. And you can even argue that Michael Cohen is sort of Trump's mini-me. That's why they got along. That's why he worked for him so long. But it's a tough case because, like I said, if it's really solely about this hush payment to this porn star and it's based on campaign finance law, it's going to be tough. It doesn't mean they can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but it'll be a tough case.
And Catherine, do they have the opportunity to revise this indictment, or are they stuck with what they have?
Well, in order to represent an indictment, you have to get permission of the court. So maybe there's another case they're investigating. I have no idea. But this is the indictment. This is, what they, spent the months on and decided to vote on. And I'll be interested to hear District Attorney Bragg's press conference. And I'm sure, all the reporters will ask him the same questions that we're all sort of baffled about.
And Chuck, weigh in for us as well. Is this a strong case?
Maybe, and I'm hedging only a little bit because when you don't have a speaking indictment, when you don't have the prosecution laying out how they're going to prove each of their counts, you have to assume that there's something that supports, that undergirds each of the 34 counts, Lester. And so we may not know the answer until perhaps the defendants file a motion for a bill of particulars asking for more information about each of the counts. We may not know until we see the evidence adduced at trial. And by the way, I just want to make a distinction between something that's weak and something that's serious, because sometimes these words are used interchangeably, but at least to me they mean something different. A case could be extraordinarily serious, a homicide, but not have a lot of evidence and therefore be relatively weak. No forensics, no motive, no confession, no eyewitnesses. Another case could be relatively, I don't want to say trivial, but less serious, and be incredibly strong because you have documents and witnesses that can testify and help prove each count. So this is a less serious case, but it doesn't necessarily make it a weak case. And for us to assess the evidence, we're going to need to see something more from the prosecutors.
NBC News legal analyst Kristen Gibbons-Fedden is with us. Were you surprised at anything that you have read so far in this indictment?
No, and I think like everyone else kind of stated, they're exactly what was suspected. But the one thing I would say is, while I agree this doesn't seem to be the strongest, I don't think that it's weak at all. I think one of the things that's really important is that, you know, in terms of forensic evidence, we do have, you know, as I'm reading quickly this indictment and the statement of facts, there does appear to be some independent indicia of intent, wherein there was invoices that said, for example, you know, retainer or for legal fees, when in fact it seems, based on the evidence, that it was actually for paying off, for example, Miss Daniels, or paying off, you know, being used as hush money. So those are some types of independent corroborative evidence that could corroborate what we imagine Cohen will say if he testifies, which will help, because he does lack the credibility of a more independent witness because of his convictions.
All right, thank you. I want to go right to NBC News national correspondent Gabe Gutierrez as we watch the former president's plane preparing to receive him and his traveling party. Gabe, we were speaking to you earlier. You were walking us through the color. If you can give us more of what you saw and witnessed in the courtroom.
Yes, Lester, as I look through my notes here, I can repeat that this arraignment was unlike any other arraignment that I've ever seen before. It lasted quite a bit longer than we expected, as you just heard, about 45 minutes. Now, I can tell you, former President Trump spoke very little during the appearance. He himself was the one who pleaded not guilty. He did so while he was sitting down. He answered just several questions from the judge, whether he understood his rights. The one time where he did show a little bit of emotion, the judge did give him a typical warning. The judge said that he would give any defendant that if the defendant were disruptive, he could be removed from the courtroom. A standard warning that the judge says he gives to any defendant. The former president responded by sighing, and he said, "I know." So something else, Lester, and I'll leave your other guests as they pour through the indictment, but there was frustration from the former president's attorneys, basically their lead attorney saying they didn't realize that they were going to have to give opening statements here. The prosecution went on at length about why they said the case should be brought, but also talked about these social media posts and these threats against the district attorney's office that they interpreted that the former president has been putting forth over the last several weeks. And of course, I can tell you, Lester, the security that we see here is due in part to those calls for protest that former President Trump brought up several weeks ago when he predicted that he might have been arrested back then. At the time, it didn't come to pass, but here we are. The prosecutors referred to specific instances where he referred to, quote, death and destruction, and also brought up a specific post that was put on the social media platform of a picture of former President Trump holding a bat near another picture of DA Alvin Bragg. Now, the defense did make the argument that, in their view, this was a presidential candidate, and this devolved into an argument between free speech. And the judge said that he would not impose a gag order in this case, even if asked. Instead, he did make a request, significantly not an order. He requested that the former president not use not use language that would incite violence. So again, what comes next here, there was some discussion about a motion schedule. I'll repeat that initially prosecutors had wanted a trial date of January 2024. However, the defense said that probably wasn't realistic. They were looking more towards a trial date of spring of 2024. No final date was issued or ruled on by the judge, but there will be motions over the next several months. Discovery will be put forth over the next several months. And we expect the next time that the former president was expected to be here in the courtroom was in December. There was also some discussion whether he might have to actually be here or whether he could waive his appearance and just let the attorneys meet here. The judge seemed inclined not to let that happen, but former President Trump's attorneys argued that because of the expense, because of the security issues, that may be a possibility down the line. But that issue remains unresolved. Something else, the prosecution wanted a restrictive order to try and prevent the former president from taking some of the discovery and actually leaking it himself, posting it on social media, using it to defend himself in the court of public opinion. again, rather than use it to mount his own legal defense. I just asked Joe Tacopina, the attorney for former President Trump, about that just now. He said that that wasn't going to happen. Those were his words. But Lester, the arraignment brought up so many questions about free speech and threats against the judicial system as this plays out. Really unprecedented in so many ways. But again, criticism from the former president's attorneys arguing that they don't have enough of a case here. But again, 34 felony counts as we await this press conference from DA Alvin Bragg to respond to questions about why this case was brought right now.
Yeah, another question about the color in the room. We know that he has a Secret Service detail. Were they evident? Were they standing near him?
Yes, there were several Secret Service agents in the room. I was also watching on a monitor to be able to see his face. It was a crowded courtroom. We were also sitting in an overflow room that was next door to that particular courtroom, but we were able to watch that video feed. And there were Secret Service agents that came into the room. The former president came straight in, stood at the center of the table, front row center, and again, stayed quiet for most of the proceedings, would occasionally lean over to talk to one of his lawyers, and again, only said very few things throughout the procedure, but the proceedings, but notably made it very clear he himself was the one who pleaded not guilty.
All right, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you for that report. And I want to note that we were watching there a moment ago the former president's plane at LaGuardia Airport. Mr. Trump, we got a glimpse of him boarding the aircraft, and he'll be heading back to Florida, planning to deliver a speech tonight. Given the remarks today about some of his statements, it will be interesting for everyone to find out exactly how far he goes in his criticism of this prosecution that is now officially underway. Hallie, it's going to be a long, if this is many months, a year. Over time, this will look different one way or the other.
Well, I mean, I look at the date that he is next going to be appearing in court based on the reporting from inside the courtroom from Gabe and Adam, December. I mean, we will be in the thick of the Republican primaries here at that point, Lester. I mean, likely we don't know what the Republican debate schedule will be. We will likely be in those at the time that the former president is showing up again in court for this. We are already getting some reaction from some of his family members. It appears from our Garrett Hake, who was also in the courtroom with Gabe, that there were no Trump family members present in court, but his son, Eric Trump, is calling this, in his words, corruption in the United States. He says Alvin Bragg shut down the whole city, called in all these NYPD officers, et cetera, all for a $130,000 NDA. He goes on to talk about what he sees, again, as the political persecution of his father. This is something we've heard from, frankly, multiple members of the Trump family, Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr., et cetera, both of whom have been active on social media for this. So you have, I think, hit the nail on the thing that I'm thinking about as we're listening to this, when a trial would be. This is colliding now, right? The legal implications with the political implications of what's to come ahead of 2024 in a serious way. And I think it is worth reminding people, as we take a look at the former president's plane, there are still other investigations outstanding here. That while we are focused on this indictment, this statement of facts, and this series of details that is in front of us here, there is potentially more out there from this Fulton County District Attorney in Georgia and from the special counsel, Jack Smith.
There may be more out there in this investigation. If you look at footnote 1 of the statement of facts, it says the statement of facts contains certain of the information that is relevant to the events described herein. It does not contain all facts relevant to the charged conduct, which makes me again wonder, is this it? Is this the end of the road? Does this investigation continue? What else do they have? They're telling a pretty robust story. They've got a mountain of evidence. You heard Chuck Rosenberg talk about a case being weak. This is not a weak case, evidentiary-wise. They have plenty of evidence. The question is whether they can make out a legally sufficient case to get a conviction.
So was the bar here simply to show probable cause and that there's more to come?
Yes, but typically, if you're a prosecutor that's conservative and wants to win your case, you want to be able to win beyond a reasonable doubt, and you want to be able to get a successful prosecution here.
All right, again, there's the look at the Trump aircraft at LaGuardia, soon departing, NYPD helicopter that has escorted it from Manhattan. What an extraordinary day this has been, and we've had a lot of them, but watching a former president face justice, surrendering himself to a courthouse in New York is extraordinary.
And the day is not over yet. I have to tell you, we are going to see Donald Trump make these remarks tonight at Mar-a-Lago. And while there is, I think, oftentimes among American voters some consternation over listening to Donald Trump speak, et cetera, this is a moment. It will be his first reaction to the facts that we have seen as laid out by the Manhattan District Attorney in this document, in this indictment. It will also be the first time that we will have an opportunity to see if those, I know his lawyers pushed back on the word warnings, but if what was raised in court about the language and the rhetoric that he has used about Alvin Bragg, about the judge, about others involved with this case, if that is going to be sort of an effective reminder for Donald Trump to essentially cut it out at that point. We're going to find out tonight, and I think a big way.
Well, we're going to find out what Alvin Bragg has to say further. He wants to speak, obviously, with his indictment and what happens in court, but he did promise to speak to reporters. We're told that is less than perhaps 30 seconds at this point away. He will meet the press and answer some of the questions that have been raised about. Yeah, you got plenty.
Laura's got a list, so yeah.
You want to be in there, I'm sure you do. He has, as we say, he's a prosecutor that holds things close to his vest. He brought in late witnesses, repeat witnesses to the grand jury down the stretch. Obviously believes in this case, and we're going to get a little more enlightenment from him in just a moment. What's the first question you want to ask him?
Why so long? And is it true that you at some point decided that you weren't going to bring this case and you changed your mind? And if you did change your mind, why? Get him to try and confirm some of the reporting or some of what we've read in Mark Pomerantz's book. That was the former volunteer district attorney who came onto the Trump investigation team and then left out of frustration with the direction. See if he'll answer any of those questions.
Is that going to become relevant at some point if you're the defense? Is that something you...
Not in terms of evidence, but it would be interesting. I started thinking about how could you get that into evidence, and you might be able to. And there may be prosecutors out there that will be howling when I suggest this creative theory, but this is what we do, come up with creative ways to get evidence in. Maybe you get it in through Michael Cohen. Why did you find at some point, Mr. Cohen, that prosecutors weren't returning your letters and your calls and that they weren't interested? What did they tell you about the case?
Well, here he is, Alvin Bragg, the DA of Manhattan County.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. Earlier this afternoon, Donald Trump was arraigned on a New York Supreme Court indictment returned by a Manhattan grand jury on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Under New York state law, it is a felony to falsify business records with intent to defraud and an intent to conceal another crime. That is exactly what this case is about. 34 false statements made to cover up other crimes. These are felony crimes in New York State, no matter who you are. We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct. The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records. He also caused others to make false statements. The defendant claimed that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. This simply was not true. And it was a false statement that the defendant made month after month in 2017. April, May, June, and so on through the rest of the year. For 9 straight months, the defendant held documents in his hand containing this key lie, that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. And he personally signed checks for payments to Michael Cohen for each of these 9 months. In total, the grand jury found there were 34 documents with this critical false statement. Why did Donald Trump repeatedly make these false statements? The evidence will show that he did so to cover up crimes relating to the 2016 election. Donald Trump, executives at the publishing company American Media Incorporated, Mr. Cohen, and others agreed in 2015 to a catch and kill scheme. That is, a scheme to buy and suppress negative information to help Mr. Trump's chance of winning the election. As part of this scheme, Donald Trump and others made 3 payments to people who claimed to have negative information about Mr. Trump. To make these payments, they set up shell companies, and they made yet more false statements, including, for example, in AMI, American Media Incorporated's business records. One of the 3 people that they paid to keep quiet was a woman named Stormy Daniels. Less than 2 weeks before the presidential election, Michael Cohen wired $130,000 to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. That payment was to hide damaging information from the voting public. The participant scheme was illegal. The scheme violated New York election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. The $130,000 wire payment exceeded the federal campaign contribution cap, and the false statements in AMI's books violated New York law. That is why Mr. Trump made false statements about his payments to Mr. Cohen. He could not simply say that the payments were a reimbursement for Mr. Cohen's payments to Stormy Daniels. To do so, to make that true statement, would have been to admit a crime. So instead, Mr. Trump said that he was paying Mr. Cohen for fictitious legal services in 2017 to cover up actual crime committed the prior year. And in order to get Michael Cohen his money back, they planned one last false statement. In order to complete the scheme, they planned to mischaracterize the repayments to Mr. Cohen as income to the New York State tax authorities. The conduct I just described and that which was charged by the grand jury is felony criminal conduct in New York State. True and accurate business records are important everywhere, to be sure. They are all the more important in Manhattan, the financial center of the world. That is why we have a history in the Manhattan DA's office of vigorously enforcing white-collar crime. My office, including the talented prosecutors you saw at arraignment earlier today, has charged hundreds of felony falsifying business records. This charge, it can be said, is the bread and butter of our white-collar work. And fraud presents itself in all different forms here in Manhattan. We have charged falsifying business records for those who violated federal bank secrecy laws. We have charged falsifying business records for those who were seeking to cover up sex crimes. And we have brought this charge for those who committed tax violations. At its core, this case today is one with allegations like so many of our white-collar cases. Allegations that someone lied again and again to protect their interests and evade the laws to which we are all held accountable. As this office has done time and time again, we today uphold our solemn responsibility to ensure that everyone stands equal before the law. No amount of money and no amount of power changes that enduring American principle. I'll now take questions.
So we're going to take a limited number of questions. There are no follow-up questions. One question per reporter. I will call on you. And again, we have limited time. Thank you. The first question will be Rick.
Why now? Some argue that this is a political move. You're not going to be a political person. The court are going to go into
We conducted a thorough and rigorous investigation, as we're known to do, at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I've been doing this for 24 years and am no stranger to rigorous, complex investigations. I bring cases when they're ready. Having now conducted a rigorous, thorough investigation, the case was ready to be brought, and it was brought.
Mr. Bragg, the indictment says that there were 34 false business records. And they were going to conceal another crime, but the indictment does not specifically say what those crimes were. We are assuming, perhaps, that they might be election-related. I'm wondering if you can specify what laws were also broken.
Sure. So let me say as an initial matter, the indictment doesn't specify that because the law does not so require. In my remarks, I mentioned a couple of laws, which I will highlight again now. The first is New York State election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. I further indicated a number of unlawful means, including more additional false statements, including statements that were planned to be made to tax authorities. I also noted the federal election law cap on contribution limits.
But why weren't there those crimes charged? Why weren't they charged with those crimes?
Well, I'm not going to go into our deliberative process on what was brought. The charges that were brought were the ones that were brought. The evidence in the law is the basis for those decisions.
Hi, Mr. DA. You had expressed a year ago that you had some reservations about the case's readiness. Can you talk to us about what were some of the questions in your mind that needed to be answered in order to bring a case of this magnitude?
I'm not going to go chapter and verse into any thinking. What I will say is, I believe the time period you're talking about, I've been in office for a couple of months. The investigation, in my view, was not concluded into the conduct in particular that is the basis for the charges today. Since that time, we've had more evidence made available to the office and opportunity to meet with additional witnesses. So, as I said earlier, I've been doing this for 24 years. I don't bring cases prior to a thorough and rigorous investigation. Now, having done so, the case has been brought.
Mr. Bragg, Garrett Hake with NBC News. Your predecessor took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Federal prosecutors took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Do you believe you have new evidence that led you to decide to charge this, or why now?
Well, as I just mentioned, we have had available to the office additional evidence that was not in the office's possession prior to my time here. And as to your part of your question about the federal, we have a distinct and strong, I would say profound, independent interest in New York State. This is the business capital of the world. We regularly do cases involving false business statements. The bedrock, in fact, the basis for business integrity and a well-functioning business marketplace is true and accurate record keeping. That's the charge that's brought here, falsifying New York State business records.
Thank you. DA Bragg, I'm just going to read back one line from your statement of facts. The participants also took steps that mischaracterized for tax purposes the true nature of payments and furtherance of the scheme. Do you allege former President Trump was one of the participants who mischaracterized the payments for tax purposes?
I'm not going to go beyond the plain language statement of facts, which I think speaks for itself.
Shana, Bragg, can you please comment on the strength of the evidence that Trump personally intended violating state election law, including actions that are charged in the indictment?
So the charge is falsifying business records. The charge requires, as I specified, criminal conduct that was concealed. One of the concealed crimes we allege is New York State election law. I sort of went through in our statement of facts, which I think many of you have in front of you, goes through things including, text messages, emails, contemporaneous phone records, multiple witnesses. All of that will be, as you saw in the fall, borne out in a public courtroom in downtown Manhattan.
Our last question is Jonah.
DA Bragg, the charges related to the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, the release from your office also mentions another woman, Karen McDougal, as well as a doorman. Can you comment on how those players are related to the charges you've brought or to the case overall?
I'm glad you put your finger on that, because it's not just about one payment. It is 34 business records, 34 false statements in business records, and we're concealing criminal conduct. And the earlier question about New York State election law, when I talked about conspiracy to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. Those unlawful means, we allege, include the conduct set forth in the statement of facts, which is, additional false statements separate and apart from the charged ones in AMI documents, planned false statements to tasking authorities. It is not just that one $130,000 wire payment. Thanks so much.
Mr. Bragg, any comment about any incitement of violence by former president?
At what point do you think that that order is necessary?
Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg holding a short news conference, shedding a little more light on the thinking behind this indictment against 34 charges against former President Trump related to falsifying business records. And let me go around the horn here with our panelists. Laura, first of all, this is now hinging, it sounds like, on a state crime that makes it a felony, not a federal crime as we had anticipated.
Well, he mentioned federal crimes, too. Obviously, there's federal limits on the amount that you can contribute to a campaign, and that's what Michael Cohen, of course, pled guilty to back in 2018. The idea there being that by making the payment to Stormy Daniels, suppressing that information out before the election, that was, in effect, a campaign contribution to Donald Trump, because it made sure that that information didn't get out before the election. So he's using that as a hook. He's using state election conspiracy as a hook, and he's also using tax issues as a hook, but not actually charging those as separate counts. So,
but does this allow him to make this, we've talked about an untested legal theory, now does it become a tested legal theory?
No. If anything, I think this makes it a little bit more complicated and a little bit tricky for him. Generally, federal election law issues are prosecuted by federal prosecutors, and there's going to be a swift motion to dismiss, I would predict, if in short order, from the former president's lawyers saying all of this should be preempted by federal law, meaning that this should have been brought by federal prosecutors, not by a state district attorney in Manhattan. Now, whether that will succeed remains to be seen. You see the district attorney saying, look, we brought plenty of false business record case. He's saying it's bread and butter. He hasn't brought one like this where you've actually obtained a jury conviction. It's gone up on appeal where it's been tested. That's why people say it's been untested. Even if they've charged false business records cases before, they haven't used a federal election law as the hook where that's been upheld but on appeal, where you can actually see a court saying, yes, this is okay. We give this the stamp of authority. It was interesting to hear him say that the law doesn't actually require that the indictment have the conspiracy and all of the other election issues pled as separate counts. Again, remains to be seen how the courts test that out, how they evaluate something like that. At the beginning of his remarks, I was struck by how much he's trying to emphasize nobody is above the law. You hear prosecutors say that all the time. But of course, in a case like this, with a defendant like this, he seemed to want to stake the ground that this is not something that I did because of who the president is, almost sort of implicitly giving a reply, if you will, a rebuttal to all of the sort of selective prosecution arguments we've heard from the former president, suggesting that he's been singled out in some way. And here you have Alvin Bragg saying, no one, no matter who you are, no matter how much money you have, everyone stands equal before the law. Sort of, that's probably the most articulation we are going to hear from him outside of court to rebut some of the president's claims.
Danny, your observations from what he just said?
If it's true that federal election law is out, then the motion to throw it out because New York doesn't have jurisdiction may be dead in the water. And that is strategically exactly what Alvin Bragg must have done. He watches TV. He probably reads the papers. He knows that this was an issue. He probably saw Joe Tacopina several times say, look, if it's federal election law, there's a problem. This case could get thrown out. So lo and behold, now they charge a New York state law. So you don't have that issue with federal election law. New York obviously can enforce its own laws. And you have conspiracy to promote or prevent election. This is what lawyers do when the indictment comes out. We go to the statute, I'm at the statute, and I'll use you as my jury. I mean, for everyone to think about, is this, by the way, it's a misdemeanor. So in other words, Bragg has used a misdemeanor to elevate a misdemeanor to a felony. I predict you're going to see some folks on the right heavily criticizing that. Essentially, they're going to argue that, hey, he used basically a traffic violation to up this to a felony. But did two or more persons, obviously, probably Michael Cohen, did they conspire to promote or to prevent an election? So we can take prevent, probably throw that out. They weren't trying to prevent it. Were they trying to promote it? Conspiracy is a specific intent crime. You need to prove that he had the specific intent to promote an election. Now, if another reason, now we get into that issue, well, what if the real reason, what if 70% of the reason was to avoid family embarrassment, which, by the way, Michael Cohen said that on the record when he pleaded guilty. So that's what Michael Cohen has said in the past. He can't really deviate from that now. So, this is what defense attorneys do. We start thinking about what makes reasonable doubt. Do I think he could be convicted on these facts? Sure. I think it's possible. But there are some defensible points here, and we're going to hear about them in the coming weeks and months.
All right. I want to go to Chuck Todd right now, moderator of Meet the Press, our political director. What are the implications of all this, Chuck? You've heard some of this conversation right now that there are parts of this case that will likely be challenged with a good deal of attention. Oh, we lost Chuck Todd. Apologize. Let's go to Garrett Hake now. Garrett was inside the courtroom. Garrett, tell us about what you saw and the body language and the tone of the room.
Lester, one of the first things I thought when the proceedings got underway is it would be almost impossible to conduct a trial in this manner. Just the amount of security necessary to move people up into the courtroom, 2 different levels of magnetometers on the ground floor and on the 15th floor, more than 30 law enforcement officers in the room, 2 rows on either side of the center aisle left clear with court officers standing in each of them to make sure the 4 or 5 reporters in each row kind of each had an officer watching us the entire time. Once Mr. Trump was seated, more officers standing behind him. They may be visible in some of the still photos that were taken inside the room. An extraordinary level of security, even for a current or former president, just not the kind of thing I was used to seeing. I will say the mood in the courtroom was very serious, very somber. You could hear a pin drop in the room most of the time. Sometimes that meant you could hear the protesters out here on the street, across the street, when there were loud activities in the park. You could hear that in some of the quieter moments in the courtroom. As for Mr. Trump's demeanor, he was very focused, looking almost entirely either straight ahead or at his own attorneys. He didn't look at the prosecuting attorneys from the state very much. He essentially ignored the presentation from a lawyer representing the various media companies who've been pushing for more access in a conference that began just beforehand. When he came into the room, he kind of looked around a little bit, originally coming into the courtroom, sort of almost scanning to see if there were faces he recognized as he came down that center aisle. On the way out, he seemed to have thought better of that and looked basically straight ahead, essentially at the back of the court officer who was leading him out of the room. We did hear him speak several times, of course, entering his own plea of not guilty and answering several questions from the judge, both about his acknowledgement of his responsibilities and the opportunities that availed to him, about his rights to appear or not appear, and about his own counsel, specifically Joe Tacopina, who a lot of people may be familiar with on television. You see him there in the background of your screen just beyond Mr. Trump on the left-hand side. But there were some questions raised by the state about previous contact he had had with Stormy Daniels before any of this got started that might render him as someone who Mr. Trump might be conflicted out of wanting on his team. Really an extraordinary hearing. A very calm Judge Bershan, who I think is a person who we're going to be talking about quite a bit, dealing with some of the questions about the way Mr. Trump has conducted himself on social media and making it very clear he does not want to impose a gag order. None was asked for today, but making clear his own opposition to that he wanted to maintain the maximum amount of free speech possible here, especially for a presidential candidate, but warning that efforts to incite violence or unrest or undermine the rule of law are the kind of things that would cause him to look more closely at motions to that effect in the future. So, we toss around the word unprecedented far too much, but this really was that. Just an absolutely incredible scene in that courtroom for about 58 minutes, all told, with Donald Trump in the courtroom and the proceedings going on, Lester.
All right, Garrett, great description of what you saw and what happened in there. We heard from Alvin Bragg, the district attorney of Manhattan, a while ago, defending this prosecution, saying that they cannot normalize serious conduct. Let me bring back former U.S. Attorney and NBC News legal analyst Chuck Rosenberg. You heard that news conference just now. What stood out to you about how they built this case, essentially?
Well, they seem to have built it, if you read through the statement of facts, the way you would build any white-collar case, with documents and with the testimony of witnesses. I will say this, as with any indictment, good defense attorneys are going to find both legal and factual challenges. Perhaps a legal challenge would be the interoperability of New York state law and federal election law. Perhaps a good factual challenge would be, as Danny referenced earlier, the notion that these payments were to save Mr. Trump and his family from embarrassment rather than for the reasons that Mr. Bragg has charged. That said, Lester, there will be multiple challenges to this these charges in this indictment over the coming months and perhaps longer. If we end up in a trial, and I suspect we will, because inevitably some of these charges are very likely to survive legal challenges, it's going to be a difficult trial. These things ought to be difficult. Prosecutors ought to be put to the test when they're seeking to convict someone and perhaps take away their liberty. I think Mr. Bragg talked about it in the right way. Nobody's above the law. And as the center of finance, New York and New York County, Manhattan, takes these types of crimes seriously. This is an unprecedented case, but it's not a statute that hasn't been used before.
And we heard Mr. Bragg talk about that these cases are commonly prosecuted by his office. This is the center of the financial world. But I think that the defense has put the question out there, would anyone else be facing this particular set of charges with these, statement of facts?
Yeah, and it sort of gets to the point, Lester, what you mean by anyone else. You mean anyone else who was running for president?
Anyone who was not running for president, I guess.
Right. I mean, there really is no one else to compare Mr. Trump to here. What you're getting at, and I think it will be the basis of a motion to dismiss, is whether or not there was a selective prosecution of Mr. Trump. That's a type of prosecutorial misconduct. If you select people for impermissible reasons, race or gender or their political party, and similarly situated people are not charged, perhaps because they're of a different race or a different gender, that is sort of a prima facie, an apparent case of selective prosecution. I expect we will see some allegation along those lines and a motion to dismiss. But there's nobody else like Mr. Trump. It's not as if there were Democrats running for president who are making hush money payments in New York County. So I think a selective prosecution motion will likely fail, but much more to come on this.
All right, Chuck, thank you. We are winding down our special coverage of today's unprecedented arraignment of former president. But before we sign off, let me just go around the horn here with our analysts and Hallie and get some final thoughts. Laura, first off.
It's striking. We've talked for so many days and weeks here about all of the other legal issues facing this former president, all of the investigations, all the scrutiny he's under, and many have mused about whether this was the right first case to bring, given everything else that he is facing. And many have pointed to the special counsel investigation in Washington, D.C., certainly the idea of somebody trying to overturn the election results, striking at the heart of democracy. But the way that prosecutors have couched this statement of facts is about undermining the heart of democracy and undermining another election. It hasn't been viewed in that way. I think all along it's been dismissed as hush money and sort of seen as something less serious. But the story that they're telling here is one about undermining an election.
Hallie?
There's one thing that Donald Trump's attorneys are making clear today in just the last hour or so, and that is he is not happy. He doesn't like this. He doesn't want it. He is frustrated and he is upset. That said, this is the reality in front of him, and we are already seeing Donald Trump understand that political reality and try to use it, frankly, to his political advantage here. As he is on that plane that we just watched take off from LaGuardia heading down to Mar-a-Lago, his campaign is sounding out a fundraising email, purportedly from Mr. Trump himself. It says, as I fly back home to Mar-a-Lago, he says, I am in great spirits because of the support from you, saying that the campaign, they say, has raised more than $10 million just since news of this indictment broke.
Dan, we got about a minute.
Yeah, for half a decade, we've wondered, would Trump ever be charged? And if so, who would be the first to do it? We now have that answer. It may not be the one that everyone expected would come, but this is the one we got, and it's game on. And we're going to see some fireworks from both sides in this case before it's all said and done.
All right, my thanks to all of you for fascinating coverage over a long day. That concludes this NBC News Special Report. And I'll talk to the right camera. We'll have much more this evening on NBC Nightly News. I'm Lester Holt. Thank you for watching, everyone. So long for now.